Cornelius Hatch didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to the Ashcroft Ranch's main house like he owned it, because in his mind, he already did. He dropped a leather satchel on Garrett Ashcroft's dining table, flipped it open, and fanned out a stack of papers thick enough to choke a horse. "Sign these tonight," Hatch said, not asking. "I'm buying 1,000 acres of your eastern grazing land, and I'm taking Vivian with the deal. She'll be married to my son by June and living in my house by July. That's how this works, Ashcroft. You owe me, and you know it." Garrett didn't move from his chair. Hatch leaned closer. "Your daughter is beautiful. My son needs a beautiful wife, and I need that land. Everybody gets what they want." "Everybody except Vivian," Garrett said quietly. Hatch smiled the way men smile when they've already won. "She doesn't get a vote. If that moment made your blood boil, good. Stay with me. This story is just getting started, and I promise you, what happens next will surprise you. If you're watching from somewhere far from Wyoming, drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit that button and the bell, because the next chapter of this story is one you genuinely cannot afford to miss. Now, let's go back to where it really began. The morning Landon Mercer rode onto Ashcroft land, the sky was doing what Wyoming skies do in early October, threatening everything and promising nothing. The clouds sat low and gray over the mountains to the west, and the wind came down off the peaks with a cold edge that cut right through a man's jacket and reminded him that winter didn't give warnings out here. It just arrived. Landon rode a brown mare named Cora. She was 14 years old, a little sway-backed, and had one white sock on her left rear leg that made her look like she'd stepped in something and couldn't get it off. She wasn't a pretty horse, neither was Landon's saddle, which had been repaired so many times along the left fender that the leather patches overlapped each other like shingles on a bad roof. The bedroll tied behind the cantle was thin. The saddlebags held 2 shirts, a box of matches, a folding knife, and $16 in paper and coin that Landon had counted twice that morning before he left his camp. He counted it because he needed to know exactly what he had. What he had was not much. The main gate of Ashcroft Ranch was a timber arch, 2 massive lodgepole pines stripped of their bark and set deep in the earth with a crossbeam overhead and the ranch name burned into a plank of pine that hung from the center. The fencing on either side was tight and clean, the kind of fencing that told you the man who owned this place paid attention to details. Posts were set even, wire was stretched proper, and the ground around the gate posts had been packed solid. No heaving from frost, which meant someone had dug those posts deep enough to matter. Landon noticed these things. He always noticed these things. He pulled Cora to a stop just inside the gate and took a long look at what lay ahead. The main house was big, but not showy. 2 stories of squared timber with a wide covered porch running the full length of the front. The barn behind it was enormous, freshly whitewashed, with its doors standing open and the sound of horses and the smell of hay coming out of it like warmth from a stove. 3 cowhands were working a corral to the east, and one of them had already stopped what he was doing and was watching Landon with the particular stillness of a man deciding whether to be friendly or fetch a rifle. Landon rode toward the house. He tied Cora at the hitching post, straightened his hat, and knocked on the front door. The woman who answered wasn't Vivian. She was a ranch cook in her 50s, broad-shouldered, flour on her forearms, and she looked at Landon the way people look at weather they weren't expecting. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Ashcroft," Landon said, "if he's available." "About what?" Landon paused for just a moment. "About his daughter." The woman stared at him for what felt like a very long time. Then she closed the door. Landon stood on the porch and waited. He could hear the cowhands in the corral behind him. He didn't turn around. He looked at the grain of the porch boards, which were swept clean and free of splinters, and he noticed that 2 of the boards had been replaced recently, the new wood still lighter than the old. Someone had taken the time to match the width. Whoever kept this house kept it with care. The door opened again. Garrett Ashcroft was not what Landon had been picturing. He was taller than Landon expected, maybe 6 feet even, with the kind of frame that had been thick with muscle once and had settled into something harder and more permanent with age. His hair had gone to iron gray, but his eyes were still sharp, a pale gray blue that reminded Landon of ice on a river, the kind of ice that looked safe until it wasn't. He wore no hat indoors, and his sleeves were rolled up past his elbows despite the cold. He looked at Landon the way Landon had looked at the fence posts, taking measurements. "You're asking about my daughter," Garrett said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "Come inside." Garrett led him to a room off the main hall that served as an office. A roll-top desk, 2 chairs, a row of shelving with ledgers and a few books, and a gun rack on the wall holding 2 rifles and a shotgun. He sat behind the desk and gestured at the chair across from it. Landon sat. "I don't know you," Garrett said. "No, sir. My name is Landon Mercer. I've been working cattle for the past 3 years, 2 seasons with the Dunbar outfit east of Laramie, and 1 with a trailing crew that brought 800 head up from Colorado last spring. Before that, I was on a farm in Nebraska from age 14. Garrett looked at his hands, which were on the desk, flat and still. Then he looked at Landon. "You're asking to court my daughter." "Yes, sir." "You have land?" "No, sir." "Cattle of your own?" "No, sir." "Money?" Landon didn't hesitate. $16. Something shifted in Garrett's expression, but Landon couldn't tell what it was. It wasn't amusement and it wasn't contempt. It was something quieter than both. "You rode onto my ranch," Garrett said, "with $16, no land, no cattle, and no family name I recognize, and you're asking to court my daughter, the same daughter that Cornelius Hatch has been pressing me to promise to his son. The same daughter that 3 other men, 2 of them with more than 1,000 acres each, have asked about in the past 6 months." "Yes, sir," Landon said. "That's about the size of it." Garrett leaned back in his chair. "Tell me why." Landon thought about the answer, not because he didn't know it, but because he wanted to say it right. "I met Vivian at the Clearwater Social last July. We didn't talk for long, maybe 20 minutes. She was being followed around by half the men in the room, and most of them were talking about themselves. I wasn't in a position to talk about myself much, so I asked her about the ranch, and she talked about it like she actually knew it. Not like a girl who grew up on money, like someone who paid attention. She told me about a section of fence on the north slope that needed reworking, and why her father hadn't gotten to it yet, and what needed to happen before winter. I don't know if she thought about that conversation again." "I thought about it quite a bit." Garrett was quiet. "I'm not under any illusion that I'm the kind of man you were planning on for her," Landon continued. "I know what I don't have. I also know what I do. I work hard. I don't quit. I don't lie, even when it's easier. And I have been thinking about that conversation since July, and thinking about her, and it occurred to me that the honorable thing to do was come speak to you directly before I said anything to her. So that's what I'm doing." The silence in the room stretched long enough that Landon could hear the wind picking up outside. Then Garrett said, "Hatch came here last week." "I heard he'd been around. He put papers on that table." Garrett nodded toward the dining room. "Wanted me to sign over 1,000 acres of eastern grazing land and agree to his son marrying Vivian. Said I owed him a debt from a land deal 15 years back." "Do you?" Garrett's eyes went a little harder. "I paid that debt in full by 1872. He disagrees, but that's a separate matter." He paused. "He said, and I'm going to tell you exactly what he said. He said my daughter doesn't get a vote in the matter." Landon felt something tighten in his chest. That's a contemptible thing to say about a person. "It is," Garrett agreed. He studied Landon for another long moment. Then he stood up from the desk, moved to the window, and looked out at the yard. The cowhands in the corral had gone back to work. Cora was standing at the hitching post, hip shot, probably half asleep. "I had a conversation with my daughter this morning," Garrett said. "I told her Hatch had been around again. She told me she would walk off this ranch and find her own way before she'd marry his son." "I believe that," Landon said. "She would do it too." There was something in Garrett's voice, not quite pride, not quite worry, both at the same time. "She didn't ask me to fight Hatch. She told me she'd handle it herself if she had to. That's my daughter." Landon didn't say anything to that. Garrett turned from the window. "Here's what I'm going to tell you, Landon Mercer. I'm not going to say yes to you today, and I'm not going to say no. I'm going to give you something else." He crossed back to the desk and sat down. "You know the Callaway place? Up the North Fork? maybe 8 miles into the foothills? I've heard of it. Young man named Ellis Calloway inherited it from his father last spring. Father was a good rancher, but he went fast. Heart gave out in April. Ellis is 22 years old. He knows cattle, but he doesn't know the mountain winters up there. He's got about 90 head going into this season, a barn that needs work, and fencing that won't hold when the snow gets serious. He's going to lose most of it if he goes in alone. Garrett set his hands on the desk. I've been thinking about sending one of my hands up to help him. A man who knows what he's doing. Spend the winter, help him get through to spring, teach him what he needs to know. Landon waited. No wages, Garrett said. I can't offer wages because Calloway can't pay them, and I won't insult the boy by paying for help on his behalf. He'd refuse it, but the work needs doing. And in exchange? Landon asked. Garrett met his eyes. In exchange, I'll take a serious look at you. When spring comes, if you come back, and if what I hear from Ellis matches what I've seen in this room, then I'll sit down with you again and we'll have a different kind of conversation. Landon looked at his hands for a moment, then back at Garrett. And Vivian? In the meantime? Garrett's expression didn't change, but something in it got more careful. My daughter makes her own choices. I won't tell her what to think of you. I won't encourage her, and I won't discourage her. That's between you and her. He paused. If she's still thinking about you come spring, that'll tell me something too. Landon was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind gusted hard enough that the window in the office rattled once in its frame. He thought about the 8 miles into the foothills. He thought about 90 head of cattle and a barn that needed work. He thought about a winter in the mountains with no wages and no guarantee of anything waiting at the end. Then he thought about 20 minutes at the Clearwater Social and a woman who talked about a fence line on the north slope like she'd walked it herself. All right, he said. Garrett nodded once, like something had been decided that he'd expected to be decided. He stood and extended his hand, and Landon shook it. I'll write a note to Ellis, Garrett said. You can take it up today if you're ready. I'm ready. He was walking back through the main hall toward the front door when he heard her. Papa? Vivian Ashcroft was standing at the top of the staircase. She had a book in her hand, her finger marking a page, and she was looking down into the hall with the particular expression of someone who has heard voices and is trying to figure out whether they need to be curious or concerned. She was wearing a dark green dress that was practical rather than fancy, her chestnut hair pulled back but not quite contained. A few strands had come loose and were hanging around her face in a way that looked less like style and more like she'd been too busy to fuss with it. She looked at Landon. Landon looked at her. He said, Miss Ashcroft, and touched the brim of his hat. She said, I don't think we've been introduced. Landon Mercer, he said. We met briefly at the Clearwater Social. You were telling me about a fence line. Something crossed her face, recognition, and then something more careful behind it. I remember, she said. You asked good questions. I try to. She glanced at her father, and whatever she read in his expression seemed to answer a question she hadn't asked out loud. She looked back at Landon. Are you staying for supper? No, Garrett said from behind Landon. Mr. Mercer has somewhere to be. Vivian held Landon's eyes for a moment longer than was necessary. Then she opened her book again and turned back toward the hallway upstairs. Safe travels then, Mr. Mercer, she said without looking back. Thank you, Miss Ashcroft, he said. He walked out the front door and down the porch steps and untied Cora and mounted up. He turned her toward the gate and started up the road. He did not look back at the house. He wanted to. He didn't. Garrett watched him go from the porch, arms crossed against the cold. He watched until the brown mare and her rider disappeared around the first bend in the road. Then he went back inside. Vivian was in the kitchen doorway when he came in. She still had the book. She hadn't opened it again. Who is he? She asked. A cowboy, Garrett said. Where's he going? Up to help Ellis Calloway get through the winter. Vivian was quiet for a moment. With wages? No. She looked at her father. Whose idea was that? Mine, he said. She went back to the kitchen without another word. But Garrett noticed she didn't open the book at supper. She sat at the table and moved food around her plate and looked out the window at the dark where the north road disappeared into the foothills. He noticed and he said nothing. Landon made it to the Callaway place before dark, but just barely. The last mile was uphill on a trail that switched back through stands of pine and aspen, the ground already frozen hard at this elevation, the wind hitting without the windbreak that the lower valley provided. Cora moved careful and steady, picking her footing, ears forward. The Callaway house was smaller than the Ashcroft place by half. A one-story log structure with a covered porch, a stone chimney putting out smoke, and a lean-to addition off the east side that had been built at a different time from the rest and showed it. The barn was 40 yards back, solid enough from the outside, but Landon could see from the way the roofline sagged on the north end that there was structural trouble up there. Ellis Callaway was in the yard splitting wood when Landon rode up. He was young. Landon had known he was 22, but he looked younger than that in person. Medium height, narrow through the shoulders, with hands that were showing the kind of roughness that comes from recent work rather than years of it. He had dark circles under his eyes, and a set to his jaw that was trying to be harder than he actually felt. He stopped splitting when Landon rode up and set the axe head on the ground and leaned on the handle. "Help you?" he said. Landon swung down from Cora and pulled the folded note from his jacket pocket. "Garrett Ashcroft asked me to bring this up." Ellis took the note and unfolded it and read it. His expression changed while he read, a few things moving across it that he didn't quite manage to keep off his face. When he finished, he refolded it and held it, and didn't say anything for a moment. "He sent you," Ellis said. "He mentioned the place." "I volunteered." Ellis looked at him. "That's not what this says." He held up the note slightly. Landon said, "Well, it's not entirely one or the other." Ellis looked at the barn, then back at Landon. "I don't need charity. I know that. If Ashcroft's paying you—" "He's not." Another pause. Ellis looked at the woodpile, which was decent but not deep enough for the winter ahead. He looked at the barn roof. He looked at Landon. "I've got 93 head," he said. "I know. The north fence on the upper pasture is dropping. 2 posts went soft this fall. I haven't gotten to it." "We'll get to it." Ellis turned the note over in his hands. There was something happening in him that he was managing carefully. The particular struggle of a young man who is exhausted and overwhelmed and too proud to show it and too honest to hide it entirely. He'd been holding this place alone since April, 7 months, at 22 years old, with his father barely in the ground. "I can't pay you," he said. His voice was level, but the effort was visible. "I know that too," Landon said. "I'm not here for pay." "Then what are you here for?" Landon looked at the barn roof again. The sag on the north end was about 8 feet of ridge beam, he'd guess, maybe a cross brace that had given way under last winter's load. "I'm here because the work needs doing," he said, "and because I've got nowhere better to be until spring." It wasn't entirely true and wasn't entirely false, and Ellis probably knew it, and neither of them said anything more about it. "There's a bunk in the lean-to," Ellis said finally. "It's cold in the morning." "That's fine. Supper's in an hour. I'll put my horse up first." Ellis nodded and picked up his axe again. He split 2 more pieces of wood before Landon got Cora into the barn. The sound of the axe was steady and deliberate in the cold air. That was how it started. The first week was the kind of week that showed you what a situation actually was, once you got past what it looked like on the outside. The barn roof was worse than the sag suggested. The main cross brace on the north section had cracked through, and 2 of the secondary beams were punky with old moisture damage, and the whole thing was being held up by a combination of friction and stubbornness. Landon pulled Ellis up there on the second morning and walked him through what he was looking at. "If we get a heavy wet snow on that section before we fix it," Landon said, "you'll lose the north stalls. Maybe the whole barn." Ellis was standing on the beam beside him, looking at the damage. "I knew it was bad," he said. "I didn't know it was this bad." "Now you know." "I don't have the timber for the cross brace. The nearest mill is—" "What do you have?" Landon asked. Ellis thought. "There's a dead pine out in the east draw that came down last winter. Straight trunk. I haven't gotten to cutting it up yet." "That'll do," Landon said. They spent 3 days on that barn roof. It was cold work, and the wind on the second day came in hard enough that they had to tie themselves off, and Ellis's hands were shaking when they came down, not entirely from cold, but the roof held. When they were done, the ridge beam was solid, and the cross braces were new, and the north end of the barn had a decade in it easy. Ellis stood back and looked at it from the yard. "My father built this barn," he said. He wasn't talking to Landon specifically. "Good bones," Landon said. Ellis nodded. He went inside to make coffee and didn't say anything else for a while, but the set of his jaw was different after that. The north fence came next. 2 posts had gone soft from ground rot, and when they pulled them up, they found the rot went deep, which meant the fence had been set in wet ground and had never been dug out proper. They dug 4 new holes, set 4 new posts, and while they were at it, Landon walked the entire north line and found 2 more sections that were starting to lean. They tightened wire and replaced staples and reset 2 additional posts, and by the time they were done, the north fence was the strongest line on the property. "You see things I miss," Ellis said one evening. They were at the kitchen table eating beans and salt pork. "You see them too," Landon said. "You just haven't learned yet what to do about them." "What's the difference?" Landon thought about it. "Experience, mostly, and knowing that most problems on a ranch tell you they're coming before they actually arrive. You just have to listen." Ellis chewed on that along with his food. "My father said something like that," he said. "He said the ranch talks to you if you're paying attention." He was right. They were quiet for a while after that. The fire in the stove popped and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with that low sound that's almost like breathing. Ellis poured more coffee. "You don't talk much about yourself," Ellis said. "Not much to say." "You were with the Dunbar outfit?" 2 seasons. "They run a good operation." "They do." Ellis looked at his cup. "Why'd you leave?" Landon considered the question. "I wanted to see what else was out there," he said. Which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated and involved the foreman's daughter and a conversation that had gone wrong in a way that still bothered him sometimes. And he didn't see the point in airing it. Ellis seemed to understand that there was more to it, and seemed to understand equally that it wasn't his business, and dropped it. "What are you going to do in the spring?" Ellis asked instead. Landon looked at the stove. "Go back to Ashcroft's place," he said. Ellis looked at him. "Garrett Ashcroft?" "Yes." A slow understanding moved across Ellis's face. He looked like he was going to ask something and then looked like he'd decided not to. "All right," he said. "All right," Landon agreed. They finished supper and cleaned up, and Ellis went to bed, and Landon sat at the table a little longer and listened to the wind in the pines. Somewhere out in the dark, the cattle in the lower pasture were bunched against the cold, heads down, breath steaming. They were still there. That was what mattered. He thought about Vivian, briefly, the way he'd been allowing himself to think about her once a day. No more. The way she'd looked at him from the top of the stairs. The way she'd said safe travels without looking back, in a tone that said something different from the words. He put the thought away. He had work to do first. The first big snow hit in November, 3 weeks after Landon arrived, and it hit hard. What started as a light dusting on a Sunday evening had turned into 14 inches by Monday morning, with the wind piling it into drifts that buried the lower fence lines and turned the upper pasture into a white field that all looked the same in every direction. Landon was up before first light, and when he opened the lean-to door, the cold hit him like a fist. He pulled on his boots and coat and hat and went to the barn. He found Ellis already there, forking hay, moving fast with the particular energy of someone running on anxiety. 7 head are separated, Ellis said without looking up. The north pasture. I counted them this morning. The gate blew open in the night and they drifted. Which direction? West, I think, into the timber. Landon pulled his saddle off the rack. Get your horse. They rode out in the half-dark, the snow still coming, visibility down to maybe 30 yards. The drifts in the low spots were thigh-deep on a horse, and Cora plunged through them with her ears flat, unhappy but working. Ellis's horse was younger and less patient about it, and kept trying to turn back until Ellis got firm with him. The cattle had gone into the timber, which was both bad and good. Bad because finding them in heavy trees in a snowstorm was difficult. Good because the trees broke the wind and the drifts were lighter under the canopy. They found the first 2 within a half mile, standing in a shallow draw with their backs to the wind. They found 3 more beyond that, bunched against a deadfall. The last 2 were a problem. Landon tracked them for an hour through the timber, reading the hoof prints before the snow filled them in, moving slow and careful while Ellis held the gathered 5 on the draw. He found the last 2 at the edge of a frozen creek, one of them standing in the water where the ice had broken through on the bank edge. The animal in the water wasn't panicking, which was almost worse. It was past that, just standing there in knee-deep icy water, not making a sound. Landon got down from Cora, tied her to a birch, and went to the creek edge. The ice along the bank was soft. He tested it with his boot, found the edge, stepped around it. The water hit him above the knee when he stepped in, cold enough to stop his breath for a second. He reached the steer, got a rope around its neck, and got it moving. The animal lurched forward and scrambled up the bank, and Landon climbed out after it, legs already going numb below the knee. He got back to Cora and stood against her for warmth and tried to feel his feet. He could, mostly. That was good enough. He gathered both strays and rode back to the draw, and he and Ellis pushed all 7 back toward the barn through the snow, which was still falling. When they got back, Ellis helped him pull off the wet boots and brought dry socks from inside and built up the stove in the lean-to until the small space was almost too hot, and Landon sat there for an hour getting his feet back. "You went into that creek," Ellis said. "The steer wasn't going to come out on its own." "You could have—" Ellis stopped. "Could have what?" Ellis looked at him. "Decided it wasn't worth it. 1 steer." Landon looked at his socks, which were steaming slightly in the heat. "It was worth it," he said. Ellis was quiet for a moment. "That steer's worth maybe $15, he said. "You're going to lose feeling in those toes for a week." "Probably," Landon said. "But I'll get it back. The steer doesn't." Ellis looked at him for a long moment. Then he went inside and came back with 2 mugs of coffee, and they sat on either side of the small stove and drank them without talking. And outside the snow came down in silence, and the wind moved through the pines, and all the cattle were in the pasture where they belonged. That was the first test. There would be more. By December, a routine had settled between them, the way routines do in hard conditions, not by agreement, but by necessity, each man falling into the tasks that suited him, the gaps between them narrowing as the weeks passed. Ellis learned to read the sky the way Landon read it, learned to check the gate latches twice every evening, learned to watch for the particular restlessness in cattle that meant a weather change was coming before the skies showed it. He was a good student, Ellis Calloway. Not because he was naturally gifted. He made mistakes, repeated some of them, argued occasionally when he disagreed, but he paid attention, and he remembered what he learned, and after a while the arguing shifted from defensive to constructive, from, "I don't think that's right," to "Are you sure about that? Because I was thinking this other way might work." Landon liked him better for it. In the 3rd week of December, a letter came up with the Ashcroft supply run. One of Garrett's hands brought provisions and grain on a sledge, and tucked between the invoices and the supply list was a sealed envelope with Landon's name on it in handwriting he didn't recognize. He waited until the evening to open it. It was from Vivian. She wrote the way she talked, direct, without ornament, but with a precision that made every sentence land. She didn't apologize for writing. She said she'd been thinking about the conversation they'd had at the Clearwater Social, specifically about the fence line on the north slope, and she'd gone up to walk it herself and found that she'd been wrong about one section. She described it in some detail. Then she said she hoped the Calloway place was managing the winter better than the north fence was managing its corner post, and asked if he'd seen any sign of wolves in the upper timber, because there'd been tracks on the Ashcroft south boundary, and her father was concerned. She did not ask how he was. She did not say she hoped he was well. At the very end, she wrote, "The north wind has been bad this week. I imagine it's worse in the foothills. I imagine you've been dealing with it." That was all. Landon read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in his saddlebag with the $16. He wrote back the next morning. He told her about the barn roof and the north fence and the creek and the cattle. He told her about the wolves. He'd seen sign twice in the upper timber and would keep watching. He described the particular way the wind came down off the peaks at this elevation, different from what he'd known in the lower valley. He did not say he'd been thinking about her. He signed it Landon Mercer and sent it back with the next supply run. Another letter came 2 weeks later, and then another. Ellis noticed the way people who live in close quarters notice things, but he didn't say anything about it. He just once, coming in from the cold, glanced at the letter on the table where Landon was reading it and said, "Supply run's already turned back around," and went to the stove, and that was all. Landon folded the letter and put it away. Outside, the mountains held their ground against the dark, and somewhere in the lower valley, 8 miles south, a lamp was burning in an upstairs room of the Ashcroft house, while a woman with chestnut hair and careful handwriting thought about fence lines and wolves and the particular quality of wind at elevation, and wrote down the things she was thinking. The snow kept falling, the cattle stayed in the pasture, and winter had only just begun. January came in like it meant to stay forever. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that had no useful description, not just below freezing, not just bitter, but the kind that made the air itself feel brittle, like if you hit it hard enough it might crack. The snow that had fallen in November and December had compacted into a dense crust that didn't give when you walked on it, and then a fresh 8 inches came down in the first week of January and sat on top of that crust and made every step a calculation. The cattle bunched in the lower pasture near the barn, pressed together for warmth, breathing out clouds of steam that hung in the still air. Landon had started waking at 4 in the morning without needing to decide to. His body had adjusted to the rhythm of the place. The cold that deepened before dawn, the particular quiet that preceded the worst weather, the way the horses moved in the barn when they were uneasy. He'd pull on his clothes in the dark of the lean-to, his breath visible inside the room, and be out checking the cattle before Ellis stirred. That was how he found the problem with the water trough on January 9th. The main trough in the lower pasture had been fitted with a simple heating element, a coiled pipe running from the stove in the barn, designed to keep the water just above freezing so the cattle could drink. Ellis's father had built it, and it had worked fine for years, but the connection fitting on the barn side had cracked in the hard cold, and the pipe had separated overnight. The trough was solid ice by the time Landon got to it. He could hear the cattle moving restlessly before he even reached it. They'd been without water for hours. He went back to the barn and got Ellis up. "Trough's frozen," he said. "Pipe fitting cracked." Ellis sat up fast, already swinging his legs off the cot. "The whole trough?" "Solid. We need to break it out and haul water from the creek while I fix the fitting." "Creek's running." "Center channel is. Ice on the edges, but it's moving in the middle." They spent 3 hours on it, Ellis breaking ice and hauling water in buckets while the cattle crowded the trough faster than he could fill it, and Landon inside the barn with cold fingers working at the fitting with a wrench and a strip of rubber he'd cut from an old boot to use as a new seal. The fitting had to be reseated and the pipe reconnected, and the whole system bled of air before the heat would transfer properly, and twice the connection didn't hold and he had to pull it apart and start again. Ellis came in after the third haul, arms shaking, ice on his coat sleeves to the elbow. "How much longer?" he asked. "Soon," Landon said. His fingers had gone past cold into something that was just absence. He couldn't feel what he was touching, which made fine work like this go slow. He pressed on. "Let me spell you," Ellis said. "I know where I am in it. Go warm up and go back out. Don't let them push the trough. They'll tip it." Ellis went back out, grumbling something that wasn't quite words. Landon got the fitting seated on the fourth try, held it, felt the pipe warm under his hand after a few minutes as the heat came through from the stove side. He held it another 10 minutes to be sure. Then he went out to the trough. The ice in it had softened to slush where the heat was returning. Ellis was standing with his back against the trough, arms out, physically blocking the nearest cattle from pushing it. "It's holding," Landon said. Ellis looked at him. His face was red from the cold and from effort and from something else. The strain of managing something that was larger than him on a day when he wasn't sure he was large enough for it. He'd been having those days more often in January, but he hadn't stopped, and he hadn't asked for the morning off, and he hadn't once suggested that maybe some of the cattle weren't worth the trouble. "My father built that fitting," Ellis said. He wasn't accusing anyone, he was just saying it. "It held a long time," Landon said. "The cold this year is worse than usual." He always said this trough was the thing he was most proud of on the place. Built it himself, all the pipe work. Said no cowman should have to haul water to his cattle in January. He was right about that. Ellis looked at the trough, where the cattle were drinking now, pressing in shoulder to shoulder, steam rising off their backs. "I fixed the latch on the north gate," he said, "like you showed me." I checked it twice last night. I know, Landon said. I saw. They stood there a while in the cold, watching the cattle drink, not saying anything. That was the thing about working alongside a person through winter. The silences stopped being uncomfortable and started just being another kind of conversation. The letters from Vivian had been coming every 2 weeks, arriving with the supply sledge and departing with it on the return run. Landon had read each one carefully and answered carefully. And what had started as a practical exchange, fence conditions, cattle counts, wolf sign, had slowly, almost without either of them noticing, become something else. She'd mentioned once, almost incidentally, that she'd had an argument with her father about Hatch. Not about the land deal, that was a separate argument, ongoing, but about something Hatch had said to her directly, at a social she'd attended with her parents in town. Landon had written back and asked what Hatch had said. She'd written, "He told me that a woman's opinion of her own future was a courtesy, not a right." Then he smiled when he said it, like it was charming. Landon had stared at that sentence for a long time before writing his response. He'd written, "What did you say to him?" She'd written back, "I told him that was a very interesting philosophy and that I'd think about it." Then I turned around and talked to someone else for the rest of the evening. He'd almost smiled reading that. Almost. He'd written, "That was well handled." She'd written, "I thought about saying more. I probably should have, but I picked the wrong ground." He'd written, "Knowing when to pick your ground is half the fight." She'd written in her next letter 2 weeks later, "I've been thinking about what you said, about picking your ground. My father does that. He never comes at a thing directly if he can come at it from the side. I used to think it was weakness. I'm starting to think it's something else." That one had stayed with Landon. He'd thought about it for 3 days before answering. He'd written, "It's not weakness, it's patience. And patience with a purpose is a different thing from giving up." He hadn't told Ellis about the letters. Ellis knew they were there. You couldn't hide much in a 2-room situation. But he hadn't pressed, and Landon respected that and returned it by not making the letters into more than they were, which was, he told himself, a correspondence. That was all. He told himself that fairly often in January. The second bad event of the month came on a Thursday, and it came fast the way bad things do in winter. Without warning, and from a direction you weren't watching, Landon was in the upper timber checking on the salt lick they'd set out for the cattle when the snow started. Not a gradual building. It came in hard and sudden, the sky going from gray to white in 10 minutes, the wind picking up so fast that the temperature dropped several degrees while he was still sitting on Cora. He turned back immediately. He couldn't see the trail. The snow was coming horizontal, driven by a wind that had no direction, or rather, had every direction at once, a full gusting mess that swirled the flakes until they were just white everywhere you looked. Cora moved carefully, picking her way, and Landon let her have her head, trusting her sense of the ground over his sense of the route. He bent low over her neck and kept his face turned against the wind and counted on her. She found the fence line on the north pasture boundary. He followed it. It took 40 minutes to get back to the barn, a trip that normally took 10. When he got Cora inside, she was shaking with the effort of it, not from fear but from cold and work, and he spent 20 minutes walking her out and rubbing her down and talking to her quietly before he bedded her with extra hay. Ellis was in the barn when he came in. "I saw the snow coming," Ellis said. "I didn't know you were up in the timber." "I got turned around briefly," Landon said. "Cora sorted it out." Ellis looked at Cora, then at Landon. "How briefly?" "Briefly enough." Ellis let it go, but that night, after supper, he said, "When I got here in April, after my father died, I rode up into the timber on the first week, just to check the salt licks and count sign. Storm came in fast. I couldn't find the fence line." He looked at his coffee. "I sat up in the trees for 6 hours before it cleared enough to ride back." Landon didn't say anything. "I should have told you the timber goes disorienting in a fast storm," Ellis said. "I should have said that when you first got here. I should have known to watch the sky better." "Still?" "Still," Landon agreed. After that, they told each other what they knew. Ellis knew this land, its particular habits, its specific dangers, the creek crossing that was deceptive in low visibility, the ridge that funneled wind in a way that could disorient a man on horseback. Landon knew weather patterns, cattle behavior, structural problems, and the kind of broad practical knowledge that came from working different outfits in different conditions. Between the two of them, they knew almost enough. The almost was what kept them careful. In February, Cornelius Hatch made a visit that wasn't to Ashcroft's place. He came up the North Road on a morning when the weather was clear for the first time in 2 weeks, riding a big black horse with a man behind him that Landon didn't know. Ellis was in the barn, and Landon was splitting wood in the yard when they came through the gate. Hatch was 60 years old, heavy-set without being soft, with a short gray beard and the kind of face that had settled into permanent disapproval over many years. He wore a good coat and a hat that hadn't seen hard weather. He rode like a man who was used to arriving and having people stop what they were doing. Landon kept splitting. Hatch pulled up his horse 20 feet away and looked at him. "You're not Calloway," he said. "No," Landon said. He set another piece on the block. "Where's the boy?" "In the barn. I'll get him for you if you state your business." Hatch looked at him the way men look at people who have said something that surprised them with its directness. The man behind him, who was younger and had the look of a hired hand more than a neighbor, shifted his horse slightly. "My business is with Calloway," Hatch said. "Who are you?" "Landon Mercer." The name meant nothing to Hatch, clearly. He looked at the lean-to, at the barn, at the wood Landon was splitting. "You work for Calloway?" "I'm helping out for the winter." "On wages?" "On my own business," Landon said. "I'll get Ellis for you." He set down the splitting maul and walked to the barn without hurrying. Inside, Ellis was forking hay, and he looked up when Landon came in. "Cornelius Hatch is in the yard," Landon said quietly. Ellis's expression changed. Not to fear. It went to something tighter and more controlled than that. He set down the fork. "What does he want?" "Didn't say. He said his business is with you." Ellis was quiet for a moment, jaw set. "Hatch had a deal with my father. Grazing rights on the Upper East pasture, the section along the ridge. My father let him run 50 head up there in the summers for a payment each year. The deal was between the two of them. I don't have it written anywhere." "Did Hatch honor it?" "For years. But last fall, after my father died, Hatch came around and said he wanted to renegotiate. Said the terms were outdated. He wanted 60 head access, and he wanted to cut the payment by half." "And?" "I told him I needed time to think about it." Ellis looked at the barn door. "I've been thinking about it since October." "What's there to think about?" "Whether I can afford to say no to him," Ellis said. "Hatch has 3 times the land I do, and twice the cattle. He's connected to the county assessor, to the bank that holds my father's note on the South 40. If he decides to make things difficult—" "He's already making things difficult," Landon said. "Showing up uninvited in February is making things difficult." Ellis was quiet. "Go talk to him," Landon said. "I'll be in the yard." "You don't need to—" "I'll be in the yard," Landon said again, evenly. They went out together. Hatch was still mounted. He looked at Ellis with the expression of a man who is accustomed to people being nervous in his presence and who uses that nervousness as a tool. "Calloway," he said. "Winter going all right?" "Well enough," Ellis said. "Good, good." Hatch looked around the property in a way that was meant to communicate evaluation. "Place is looking better than I expected, honestly. Thought it might get away from you after your father passed." Ellis didn't respond to that. "I came to settle the grazing matter," Hatch said. "I'm putting my summer crew together early this year. Need to know if the East Pasture arrangement is continuing." "Under what terms?" Ellis asked. "The terms I mentioned in October, 60 head, half the previous payment." "The original terms were 45 head and a fair payment," Ellis said. "My father's terms." "Your father's dead," Hatch said. Not unkindly, just flatly. The yard went quiet. Even the wind seemed to pull back. Landon was standing 8 feet to Ellis's left with his hands at his sides. He didn't move. He watched Hatch the way you watch a horse that's showing the whites of its eyes. Not with alarm, but with the specific attention of someone deciding where to stand when the thing goes sideways. Ellis said, "I understand that. I'm asking about the terms of the agreement, not about my father." "The terms are what I've offered," Hatch said. "I think carefully about turning them down, son. You've got a banknote due in March. Your father arranged it before he passed. Probably didn't have time to tell you much about it." And there it was. Landon saw it come across Ellis's face. The realization that Hatch knew about the note, which meant Hatch was connected enough to the bank to have that information, which meant the threat wasn't hypothetical. Hatch waited. He was patient. Patient men with power are the most dangerous kind. Ellis said, "I'll need until the end of the week." "You've had since October." "I'll need until the end of the week," Ellis said again. His voice didn't shake. That was something. Hatch looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Landon, the way he'd been not looking at Landon since the conversation started, directly, suddenly, measuring. "You said you're helping out for the winter," he said to Landon. "That's right." "Ashcroft send you?" Landon said. "I came on my own." Hatch gathered his reins. "End of the week, Calloway." He turned his horse and rode out with his man behind him, not looking back. They stood in the yard and listened to the hoofbeats go down the road and disappear. Ellis let out a breath. "He knows about the note," he said. "Yes." "How does he know about the note?" "He's well connected, like you said." "That's not a coincidence. He's been planning this." Ellis turned toward the barn, then stopped. "My father must have mentioned the note to someone, or Hatch has a man at the bank." "Probably the second one," Landon said. "If I don't agree to his terms and he calls in a favor at the bank." "When is the note due?" "March 15th, Landon thought. "How much?" Ellis told him. It was not an enormous sum, but it was more than Ellis had on hand, and Landon knew that without asking. "Write to Ashcroft," Landon said. "Tonight. Tell him what just happened." Ellis looked at him. "I'm not asking Ashcroft for money." "I didn't say ask him for money. Tell him what happened. He's been doing business in this territory for 30 years. He'll know Hatch's connections, and he'll know what Hatch can and can't do through the bank. You need information more than you need money right now." Ellis was still. "You think Ashcroft will help?" "I think Ashcroft is the kind of man who helps," Landon said, "and I think he's been watching this situation longer than either of us knows." The letter went out with the next supply run. The answer came back 4 days later, not in a letter, but in person. Garrett Ashcroft himself rode up the North Road on a gray morning with one of his hands behind him. He didn't make a production of arriving. He came into the yard, tied his horse, shook Ellis's hand, shook Landon's, and said, "Where do you want to talk?" They went inside. Garrett sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and his coat still on, and Ellis told him everything, Huffs. The original arrangement, Hatch's October visit, the banknote, the February confrontation. He told it plainly without embellishment. Landon sat to the side and said nothing. Garrett listened without interrupting. When Ellis was done, Garrett put his hat on the table. "That note on the South 40, he said. "I know it. Your father arranged it through the Territorial Savings Bank 3 years back. The man Hatch has there is a loan officer named Strick. He doesn't have the authority to call in a note early. The terms don't allow it without cause. But he has the authority to create delays, to lose paperwork, to make the renewal process complicated." "Can he do that without cause?" Ellis asked. "He can try. The law doesn't support it. But lawyers cost money, and Hatch knows that." Ellis looked at the table. "Here's what you're going to do," Garrett said. "You're going to write a letter to the bank. I'll help you word it, formally requesting written confirmation of your note terms and your renewal eligibility. You send it certified. That creates a record, and it tells Strick that you know your rights and you're documenting them. Hatch's leverage depends on you not knowing what you can push back on." "And the grazing agreement?" Ellis said. "What were the original terms exactly?" Ellis told him. Garrett nodded slowly. "Your father shook hands on that deal with Hatch in, 1878? 1879? My father said 1877. I remember the summer. Hatch was expanding then. He needed summer pasture, and your father had the good East Ridge." Garrett looked at Ellis directly. "Hatch wasn't offering you bad terms in October because the original ones were unfair. He was offering you bad terms because your father just died and he thought you were too young and too shaken to know what you had." Ellis was quiet. "You have something Hatch wants," Garrett said. "That East Ridge pasture is some of the best summer grazing in this part of the territory. He'll push as far as you let him push, and then he'll stop. He looked at Landon for the first time in a while. How's the place shaping up? Better every week, Landon said. The barn roof? Fixed. North fence is solid. We've got the trough of water working again after the fitting cracked. Garrett looked around the kitchen, at the state of it, the order, the supply organization visible on the shelves. He looked at Ellis. Your father taught you well, he said. Landon's taught me the rest, Ellis said. Garrett didn't respond to that directly. He put on his hat. I'll stay for lunch if it's no trouble, and then I'll ride back. I want to see the north fence before I go. They ate, and then they walked the north fence with Garrett, who ran his hand along the new posts and checked the wire tension and said nothing except once, at the corner that had been the worst section, where he crouched down and looked at how the post had been set. That's a proper set, he said to no one in particular. Then he shook hands again and rode south with his man behind him, and the yard was quiet. Ellis stood there for a moment looking at the road. He came up here himself, he said. Yes. He didn't send a letter. He came up. He's that kind of man, Landon said. He picked up the splitting maul from where he'd left it that morning and went back to work. The bank letter went out, worded carefully with Garrett's help. No response came from Strick at the bank, but no complication came either. And when March 15th arrived, the note renewed without incident. The paperwork came back signed and proper, no delays, no lost documents. Whether Strick had backed off on his own or whether Hatch had decided the ground wasn't right for a fight, neither Ellis nor Landon could say. What mattered was the land was clear. Ellis told Landon the morning the paperwork came back. He held up the documents and looked at them for a long moment. My father would have known how to handle that, he said. I wouldn't have without you and Ashcroft. You'd have figured it out. Maybe, slower. He set the papers down. I'm going to write Hatch and tell him the original terms stand. 45 head, full payment. If he doesn't like it, he can find other summer pasture. He won't find as good, Landon said. No, Ellis agreed. He won't. He wrote the letter that afternoon. Hatch's reply came back 10 days later. Short, not friendly, but accepting the original terms. Landon read it when Ellis passed it across the table. He'll remember this, Landon said. Let him remember it, Ellis said. My father made a fair deal. I'm honoring it. That's all I'm doing. The last big storm of the season came in the second week of March, and it was the worst one. 4 days of snow and wind that kept them both in the barn and the house in rotation, checking cattle twice in the night, breaking ice wherever it formed, moving the weakest animals into the barn's interior stalls. One cow went down on the third day. Too thin, had been struggling all winter despite extra hay, and they couldn't get her up. Ellis sat with her for 2 hours that evening, trying. Landon checked on him near midnight. Ellis was still there, sitting against the stall wall with his coat pulled around him, the cow's head in his lap. She was breathing, but slow. She was my father's, Ellis said. He bought her at a sale in Cheyenne in 1879. Said she was the best breeding cow he ever owned. Landon sat down on the other side of the stall. They sat there until about 2 a.m. when the breathing stopped. Ellis stayed where he was for a while after. Landon didn't move either. I'm going to lose more before I'm done with this, Ellis said finally. Yes, Landon said. That's ranching. My father made it look like you didn't lose things. You don't see what a man absorbs when you're watching him from outside. Ellis looked at him. What do you mean? He lost things too. He just kept working after. Ellis was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the storm was finding its voice again, the wind shaking the barn walls, the cattle in the interior stalls moving close together. How do you know that? Ellis asked. Because every man who's ranched for 20 years has lost things, Landon said. The ones still going are the ones who absorbed it and kept working. That's the whole of it. Ellis sat with that. At some point before dawn, they moved the cow. It was hard work in the dark and the cold, but they did it, and neither of them talked much while they did. And when it was done, they went inside and Landon made coffee, and Ellis drank it without tasting it and eventually went to bed. By the end of March, the storm had broken and something had changed in the air. Not warmth, exactly. Not yet. But the particular quality of cold that tells a person the worst is behind them. The snow was still deep in the upper pasture, but it was settling and not adding. The creek had opened along its center channel. 2 of the cows dropped calves in the 3rd week of March, healthy ones, and Ellis stood at the stall fence watching the second one find its feet, and Landon stood beside him, and neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything that needed saying. 93 head had gone into the winter. 91 came through, plus 2 new calves. Ellis did the count on a Tuesday morning in late March, walking the lower pasture in mud and the last of the heavy snow, tallying, checking, and when he came back to where Landon was standing at the pasture fence, he said the numbers out loud. 91, he said, plus 2. That's a good winter, Landon said. Is it? For this country, in a year like this? Yes. Ellis leaned on the fence. My father's best winter, he told me, was 1875. Lost 4 head, had 11 calves. He talked about it like it was a miracle. This wasn't quite that, Landon said. No, Ellis said, but it wasn't bad. He was quiet for a moment. You're leaving soon. It wasn't a question. When the trail's passable, Landon said. Ellis nodded. He looked at the cattle in the pasture, moving easier now that the snow was softening, spreading out instead of bunching. He looked at the barn with its solid roof and the north fence with its proper corner post, and he looked at the 2 new calves standing knock-kneed and ridiculous in the morning light. I'm going to be all right, Ellis said. It sounded like he was trying the words out to see how they fit. Yes, Landon said. You are. Ellis turned and looked at him directly. Tell me something. Did Ashcroft send you, or did you come on your own? Landon thought about how to answer that. Ashcroft told me about the situation, he said. I made the choice. Ellis held his eyes. Why? The honest answer was complicated, and Landon turned it over for a moment before he spoke. Because the work needed doing, he said, and because sometimes the right next thing is just the thing that's in front of you. Ellis considered that. Then he said, Whatever happens when you get back to Ashcroft's place, I hope it goes the way you want it to. Landon pushed off the fence and picked up the bridle he'd been about to carry to the barn. One thing at a time, he said. He went to saddle Cora. The trail south was passable by the 1st of April. Still muddy in the low spots, still snow in the heavy timber, but passable. Landon loaded his saddlebags on the morning he left, which was a Tuesday, early enough that the frost was still on everything and the birds were just starting in the pines. He'd washed his 2 shirts and they were dry and folded. The $16 were still in the bottom of the saddlebag where they'd been all winter. Ellis stood in the yard. They shook hands. All right, Ellis said. I know you will, Landon said. He mounted Cora and turned her toward the gate. She moved with purpose. She knew the direction south, and she was ready for it. He went through the gate and down the road, and the sun was coming up behind the mountains to the east, throwing long light across the snow that remained, and Cora's shadow stretched long beside her as they went. Landon didn't count what he'd done that winter. He didn't add it up or assign it a value. The barn roof was sound. The fence was solid. The cattle were in the pasture, 91 of them, plus 2 calves. Ellis Calloway knew how to read the sky and check the latches and sit with the things that couldn't be fixed and keep working anyway. That was what there was. He rode south toward the Ashcroft Ranch, where everything was still uncertain, where Garrett Ashcroft was waiting with his pale gray-blue eyes and his unfinished judgment, and where Vivian Ashcroft, who had written him 11 letters over the course of a Wyoming winter, and who had never once asked how he was doing, only what he was doing, was waiting too, or wasn't, and he didn't know which, and he wasn't going to know until he got there. The mud sucked at Cora's hooves on the low stretch. She pulled free and kept going. 8 miles was not far. It only felt that way from the wrong end of a winter. He came down off the North Road on a Tuesday morning in early April, and the first person to see him was one of Garrett's hands, a weathered man named Colfax who was mending a section of south fence along the road and who looked up from his work and watched Landon ride past without saying anything, just tracking him the way a man tracks something he's been told to watch for. Landon noticed. He rode on. The Ashcroft yard looked the same as it had in October, and different in the way that everything looks different after 6 months of something hard. The porch boards were still swept clean. The barn doors stood open. The corral to the east held 4 horses that hadn't been there in fall. The yard itself was soft with the first week of April mud, and Cora's hooves made a sucking sound with each step as Landon came through the gate and crossed to the hitching post. He tied her. He straightened his hat. He looked at the front door for a moment. Then he knocked. The cook opened it again, same as before, flour on her forearms. She looked at him the way you look at someone you recognize but weren't certain you'd see again. "Mr. Ashcroft in?" Landon asked. "He is," she said. "He's been expecting you." She let him in. Garrett was in the office, same chair, same desk, same rifles on the wall. He was reading something when Landon came in, and he set it down without hurrying, the way a man sets down something he was only partly reading anyway. He looked at Landon the way he'd looked at him in October, measuring, and what he was measuring now was the difference. There was difference. Landon had lost weight he hadn't had to spare, and the cold had left marks on his face, and the scar on the back of his right hand from where a piece of the barn roof crossbrace had caught him in December was still pink and new-looking. His coat was the same coat. His hat was the same hat. The saddle on Cora outside was the same saddle with the same overlapping patches on the left fender. Garrett looked at all of that, and then he looked at Landon's eyes, and then he gestured at the chair. Landon sat. "How is Ellis?" Garrett asked. "Good," Landon said. "Better than good by the end. He's going to be fine." "The cattle?" 91 through. 2 calves born in March, both healthy. Barn roof is solid. North fence is rebuilt proper. I found 2 additional sections failing while we were at it. The trough heating system had a fitting crack in January and we repaired it. He's got the note renewed on the South 40. Terms unchanged. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "He told me about Hatch's visit, in his letter." "I figured he would." "What did you think of the way Ellis handled it?" Landon considered. He was shaken. He didn't show it to Hatch, but he was. He didn't know what Hatch could actually do versus what he was implying he could do. Once he had the information he needed, he stood his ground well. "He said you told him to write to me." "He needed information. You had it." Garrett nodded slowly. "What did you think of Hatch?" Landon's answer came without much pause. He's the kind of man who calculates how much he can take before someone pushes back. And he's usually right about his calculations because most people don't push back. Ellis surprised him. "Ellis surprised me too," Garrett said. They sat with that for a moment. Garrett put his hands flat on the desk, the same gesture Landon had seen him use in October. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to let me finish before you say anything." "All right," Landon said. "I sent 4 letters to people over the course of the winter. Ellis, you know about. I also wrote to the foreman at the Dunbar outfit, east of Laramie, where you worked 2 seasons. I wrote to the crew boss who brought the trail herd up from Colorado last spring. And I wrote to a man named Bryce Alderman who ranched near the Nebraska farm where you grew up, and who's been in this territory for 6 years and who I know from a cattle association." He paused. "I asked each of them about you." Landon was still. "I told you I'd look into things," Garrett said. "This is what looking into things means for me. I don't do it halfway." "What did they say?" Landon asked. He kept his voice level, though something had tightened in his chest that he didn't quite name. "The Dunbar foreman said you were the best hand he'd had in 10 years, and that he'd made a mistake letting you go, and that the reason you left had something to do with a situation involving his daughter and another hand, and that the fault in that situation was not yours." Garrett said this without inflection. He didn't go into detail, and I didn't ask for detail. Landon looked at the wall. "The trail boss from the Colorado Drive said you were steady in bad conditions, and that you had a way with difficult cattle, and that you once rode back 3 miles in a lightning storm to collect 2 head that had separated, and that he'd tried to hire you for the next season, and you'd declined." "I was moving on," Landon said. "Bryce Alderman said he'd known your family since you were 10 years old. He said your father was a hard man in the way that some farming men get hard, and that you left for ranch work at 14 because the situation at home had become untenable, and that in his opinion you were the most capable and honest young man he'd known in 40 years of frontier living." Garrett paused. Those were his words exactly. The tightness in Landon's chest had moved somewhere less comfortable. He didn't say anything. And Ellis, Garrett said, wrote me 3 letters over the winter. The last one came 2 weeks ago. He said, Garrett reached into the desk drawer, pulled out a folded paper, and read from it directly. Landon Mercer went into a frozen creek in November to pull out a steer worth $15 when he could have written it off without any reasonable man questioning him. He fixed our barn roof in conditions I wouldn't have attempted alone. He taught me how to read the sky and the cattle and the land, and he did it without making me feel like a boy who didn't know anything. I'm going to be a better rancher because of this winter, and that is entirely because of him. I don't know what your arrangement with him is, but whatever it is, you should honor it. Garrett folded the letter and put it back in the drawer. That last sentence is very Ellis Calloway. Landon almost said something and then didn't. Garrett leaned back. Now, is there anything you want to say? Landon thought for a moment. The foreman at Dunbar, he said. The situation with his daughter. I want you to know the shape of it, since he mentioned it. You don't have to. I want to. Landon looked at the desk. She was interested in me. I wasn't in the same position. I told her so directly because I thought that was the honest thing. Another hand, the foreman's nephew, told the foreman I'd behaved improperly toward her. He was lying. The foreman believed him first because he was family, and then looked into it and believed me second, but by then I'd already decided to leave. I didn't want to stay somewhere that had gone sideways like that, regardless of how it resolved. Garrett said nothing for a moment. Why tell me? Because it's the kind of thing a man should say directly if it's going to be known about. Garrett studied him for what felt like a long time. Then he said, All right. He stood from the desk and moved to the window, same as he'd done in October, looking out at the yard where Cora was standing at the hitching post, looking toward the barn with the hopefulness of a horse who has been ridden 8 miles and knows there should be hay somewhere nearby. I made my daughter a promise when she was about 16, Garrett said, still looking out the window. I told her I would never make a decision about her life without her voice in it. Her mother was still alive then. She made me promise that too, separately. He was quiet for a moment. I have kept that promise. I will continue to keep it. I'm glad, Landon said. Garrett turned from the window. She knows you're coming back today. Landon went still. How? I told her. Something in Garrett's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the muscle change that precedes one stopped just short. She's been out on the north slope since early this morning, said she needed to check on that corner fence post she mentioned in a letter. A beat of silence. Did she say anything else? Landon asked. She said she'd be back by noon. Garrett looked at Landon with those ice river eyes. It's 10:30. Landon stood. Mr. Ashcroft. Go find her, Garrett said. Bring her back in time for lunch. Then we'll have the other conversation. Landon was out the door and untying Cora before he'd fully decided to move. He mounted and turned her north, toward the slope road, and she moved into a trot without being asked, probably because the direction was away from the barn rather than toward it, and she'd accepted this about their life together. The north slope of the Ashcroft property was a long rise through stands of mixed timber, pine and aspen, with open meadow grass breaking through where the soil was right. The fence line Vivian had mentioned in letters ran along the upper edge of the slope, marking the boundary between the Ashcroft summer pasture and the open range above. It was good grass up here, the kind that came in thick and sweet in the high elevation and finished cattle well before fall gather. He found her at the corner post she'd described. She was crouched beside it, both hands on the post, rocking it slightly to test its set. Her chestnut hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat and her coat dark against the pale morning light. She had a small toolkit in an open saddlebag on the ground beside her, and her horse, a bay gelding, stood 15 feet back with his reins dropped. She didn't look up when Cora's hooves came through the grass, but she said, Post's soft at the base. I think the frost got into the hole last fall and heaved it. Needs pulling and resetting, Landon said. I know. She looked up then, and looked at him the way she'd looked at him from the top of the staircase in October, with the particular expression of someone who has already thought through what they're going to say and has decided to say something else instead. You look terrible, she said. Thank you, he said. I mean it. You lost weight. February was light on provisions. I know. I packed 3 of those supply sledges myself. She stood and brushed her hands on her coat. My father writes me about what he sends and what comes back on the supply ledger. You and Ellis were eating about 60% of what two grown men should be eating in January. We had enough. You had enough to keep working, she said. That's not the same thing. She looked at Cora. She looks thin, too. She's fine. I'll have Colfax bring her extra grain. She doesn't need... She went through a mountain winter carrying you, Vivian said. She gets extra grain. There was no room for discussion in her tone, not because she was being imperious, but because the logic was simply complete. She bent and picked up her toolkit and put it back in the saddlebag. Landon swung down from Cora and dropped her reins. He walked to the corner post and put his hands on it and felt the give in the soil around it. She was right about the frost heave. There was maybe 1.5 inches of movement in the post, which was enough to weaken the wire tension on two sides of the corner. I'll get it, he said. You just rode 8 miles. I can reset a fence post. She looked at him. The morning light was doing things to the color of her eyes that the poor light of the Clearwater Social and the dim hallway of the ranch house hadn't prepared him for. They were genuinely green, not gray-green, a color that didn't quite have a comparison he could grab at. He registered this and set it aside. There's a bar in the saddlebag, she said. He got the bar and started on the post. The ground was soft enough from the spring thaw that it moved without too much trouble. The frost had heaved it, but it had also loosened the surrounding soil, and he had the post out in about 10 minutes. He dug the hole down another 6 inches to below the old frost line, then tamped the base and reset the post with rocks packed around the base and the good clay subsoil packed back in layers. Vivian watched some of it and then started on the wire tension, tightening the staples on the uphill side that had gone slack. She worked with the particular efficiency of someone who has done this many times but still pays attention to doing it correctly. "How is Ellis?" she asked. "Good. Your father asked the same thing." "He would." She pulled the wire taut and drove a staple. Ellis lost his father in April and managed his first mountain winter alone. That's not a small thing. He wasn't entirely alone. He was more alone than he should have been at 22. She said it without accusation. It was just a fact she'd thought about. He handled the Hatch situation well. You know about that? My father tells me things. Not everything, but things. She moved to the next staple. Hatch tried something similar with us 8 years ago. A water rights claim on the East Creek. My father spent 3 months documenting the original survey records before he made a single move. Hatch backed off when the paperwork showed up. Landon packed the last layer of soil around the post and tested it. Solid. Your father mentioned Hatch came here in the fall, with papers on the table. Vivian's hands paused for just a moment on the wire. Then she went back to the staple. He did. What happened? My father told him the debt had been paid in full in 1872, and that if Hatch had evidence otherwise, he was welcome to present it to a territorial judge. She put the staple tool down. Then my father looked at the papers on the table and said he'd need time to review them. Hatch left them. My father reviewed them that night. And the land description in the transfer clause had a surveying error, a significant one. If my father had signed, he'd have ceded about 200 acres more than the stated 1,000, including the water rights on the North Creek. Intentional, in my father's opinion. Was he right? Hatch doesn't make clerical errors, she said simply. Landon stood and looked at the post and the reset wire. The corner was solid now, the tension even on both sides. He handed the bar back to Vivian, who put it in the saddlebag. "What did Hatch say to you?" Landon asked. "At the social, the thing you wrote me about." She was quiet for a moment, her back to him, buckling the saddlebag. He said a woman's opinion of her own future was a courtesy, not a right. "I remember." "What I didn't write," she said, "was what he said after that. He said..." She turned around. She was composed, but the composure had something working underneath it. He said that my father was a sentimental man where I was concerned, and that sentiment was a weakness in a businessman, and that sooner or later sentimentality about a daughter's preferences would cost Garrett Ashcroft more than it was worth. Landon felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He was threatening your father. Through me. Yes. She looked at him steadily. I've been thinking about that since November. What conclusion did you reach? That Hatch is more afraid of my father than he pretends to be, and that men who use women to threaten other men are usually afraid of both. She picked up her horse's reins. Also that I should have said something at that social instead of walking away, but I picked the wrong ground, as you wrote. I wrote that patience with a purpose is different from giving up, Landon said. I know what you wrote, she said. They stood 10 feet apart in the April morning on the north slope of the Ashcroft property, and the wind came down from the higher country with the smell of snowmelt and pine in it, and the two horses stood nearby being patient about all of this. I have 11 letters from you, Vivian said, and you have 11 from me. Yes. In all of them you told me what you were doing. You never told me what you were thinking. No, he said. Why? He considered the question honestly. Because the letters were real, and I didn't want to put anything in them that would be complicated to take back if things went differently than I hoped. She looked at him. And now? Now I'm standing here, and your father told me to come find you, and I'm not sure there's a version of this conversation that's uncomplicated. There isn't, she said. I'm aware of that. Then I'll tell you what I was thinking, he said. I was thinking about you once a day, every day, from October to April. I rationed it because I had work to do, and thinking about you too much would have made the work harder, but once a day, without fail. She was very still. I thought about the 20 minutes at the Clearwater Social, he said, and about the way you talked about this ranch like it was the most interesting thing in the world, not because you had to live here, but because you actually found it interesting, and about the fact that you were being followed around by men with money and land, and you were thinking about a fence line. Vivian was quiet for a moment. It was a genuinely problematic fence line. I know, I read all your letters. It still hasn't been fully addressed on the south section. I know, she said. I was going to mention that. We can look at it on the way back. She looked at him for a long moment, taking her own measurement, her own accounting, in a way that reminded him of her father and probably always would. Then she said, My father is going to want to have a conversation with you today. He said as much. He'll make you an offer of some kind. He's been thinking about it for weeks. I can tell when he's working something out. He gets very quiet at dinner and then very specific the next morning about which ledgers he wants to review. Do you know what the offer is? No, he doesn't tell me the business details. She picked up her horse's reins fully and moved to mount. He does tell me when he thinks someone is worth doing business with. He told me that about you. In January. Landon stood with that for a moment. He said, she settled in the saddle and looked down at him. He said you'd gone up to Calloway's place with $16 and no wages agreed and no guarantee of anything, and that in his experience, the men who did things like that were either reckless or they were the real thing, and he was increasingly of the opinion that you were the real thing. What did you say? Landon asked. I said I'd been thinking the same thing since October. He mounted Cora. They rode back south along the fence line, and at the section she'd identified in a letter back in December, a stretch of about 60 feet where the wire had gone loose and two posts were leaning, they stopped and looked at it. It needs pulling and resetting, Vivian said. Same as the corner. More extensive, though, probably a full day's work. I know. She looked at the wire. I tried to get to it in February, but the ground was too hard. Then I kept meaning to come back. We'll get to it, he said. She looked at him quickly, just briefly, at that we. Then she looked back at the fence. Yes, she said, we will. They came back down the slope road and into the yard at 20 minutes to noon, and Garrett was on the porch when they came through the gate. He looked at them, at both of them, the way a man looks at two things together and reads what the combination says rather than what each part says separately. He didn't say anything about what he was reading. Fence post? He said. Reset, Vivian said. There's a section about 300 yards down the line that needs a full day. I'll put Colfax on it. I'd rather do it myself, she said. Garrett looked at her, then at Landon. After lunch, he said. Landon and I have some business to discuss. I know, Vivian said. She handed her horse to a hand who'd come forward from the barn and went up the porch steps. At the door she paused and looked back at Landon, who was still mounted. "Come inside," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten a real meal since October." "He probably hasn't," Garrett said and held the door. Lunch was the best thing Landon had eaten in 6 months, and he was aware enough of how he was eating to slow himself down twice, which was embarrassing. But there it was. The cook had made a beef stew with proper root vegetables and fresh bread, and there was coffee that didn't taste like it had been boiled 4 times. And Landon worked through 2 bowls of stew and 3 pieces of bread while trying to look like a person who had merely been slightly hungry rather than consistently underfed since November. Vivian pretended not to notice. Garrett noticed and said nothing. Afterward, they went back to the office. Garrett sat behind his desk. Landon sat across from it. It was the same arrangement as October, but the room felt different. The same dimensions, but less like a testing ground and more like a working space. "I'm going to make you an offer," Garrett said. "I want you to listen to all of it before you say anything." "All right. I have 300 acres of eastern grazing land that I've been running light because I don't have enough hands to work it properly, and I haven't found a foreman I trust to develop it the way it should be developed. The grass on it is good. Same elevation as the Callaway East pasture, similar soil. It's been underused for 6 years. He paused. "I'm not going to give it to you. I'm going to lease it to you at a fair rate starting this spring for a 5-year term with renewal option. You build your own cattle operation on it. You work it yourself, hire your own hands when you need them, answer to yourself on the daily decisions." Landon listened. "I'll help you with the starting stock. I've got 20 head of cull cattle that are actually good breeding animals, just more than I need for my numbers right now. You can take them on a buy now, pay later arrangement, deducted from your first year's lease and trade. That gives you something to build from without starting from nothing." Garrett put his hands flat on the desk. "In exchange, I want first option on any cattle you want to sell before they go to the open market. Fair market price, no taking advantage either direction. And I want you working with my main operation on the big seasonal jobs. Spring branding, fall gather. Separate wages for that work, separate from the lease arrangement. The 2 businesses stay separate." He looked at Landon. "That's the offer." Landon was quiet. "Now say what you're thinking," Garrett said. "The lease rate," Landon said. Garrett named it. It was fair, genuinely fair, not lowballed in a way that created hidden obligation. Landon had been doing the arithmetic in his head since the second sentence, and the numbers worked if he was careful, and the first season went reasonably well, and he didn't have a catastrophic winter. The 20 head of starting stock was the thing that made it possible. Without that, even a fair lease was too thin a ledge to build on. "The 20 head," Landon said. "What condition are they in?" 3 are young cows, good breeding. 6 are steers that have been on good grass and should finish well this fall. The rest are mixed, some younger, 1 older cow that's past peak but has another 2 good years. I'll write you a full account before you make any decisions." Landon looked at the floor for a moment, then at Garrett. "Can I ask something that's not about the business side?" Garrett waited. "Why?" Landon said. "You could lease that land to any number of men with more experience and more capital. You could get a better return faster." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you something about this ranch, about how I came to have it." He leaned back. 32 years ago, I was 24 years old. I was a cowboy working for a man named Devereaux in the territory east of here. A big operation, well run, and I had been there 4 years and I knew the land and the cattle about as well as any hand he had. Devereaux had a daughter. Landon was very still. "Her name was Margaret," Garrett said. "She is Vivian's mother. She has been gone for 9 years. He said it without visible grief, but the absence of visible grief on a face like Garrett Ashcroft's had its own kind of weight. I went to her father and asked permission to court her. I had nothing. No land, about $30, a horse that was in better shape than me. He asked me what I had to offer his daughter. What did you say? I said I had the ability to work harder than any man he'd hired, and the intention to keep doing it for the rest of my life, and that I loved his daughter in the particular way that makes a man want to build something rather than just occupy something. Garrett's expression didn't change. He told me that was a fine speech, and that he was going to send me to work a struggling homestead for a full season with no wages and no promises, and if I came back in the spring, he'd talk to me. Landon sat with the symmetry of this. I came back in the spring, Garrett said. He talked to me. He gave us a start, a small one, fair terms, nothing he couldn't afford to lose. It took Margaret and me 8 years to build this place to what it became. 8 years of winters not unlike the one you just had. He paused. The man who helped me with that start died in 1871. I never adequately thanked him. I've been thinking about that for 13 years. This isn't about thanking someone, Landon said. He didn't say it defensively. He said it because it mattered to be accurate. No, Garrett agreed. It isn't. It's about the fact that I know what I'm looking at when I see it. I've spent 32 years learning to look at land and cattle and men and assess what they are and what they'll become. And I'm telling you with full confidence in that assessment that you are exactly what you appear to be, which is not common. He picked up a pen from the desk. The offer stands. Think about it tonight if you need to. I don't need to, Landon said. I accept. Garrett looked at him. You're not going to negotiate? The terms are fair. Negotiating a fair offer is its own kind of insult. Something crossed Garrett's face, a decision completing itself, the last piece of a long calculation arriving at its sum. He set down the pen. All right, he said, then welcome to the Eastern pasture. They shook hands across the desk. Garrett's grip was the grip of a man who had been building things with his hands for 30 years, and Landon's was the grip of a man who had spent a winter doing the same, and the handshake lasted exactly as long as it needed to and no longer. What happened next was not immediate. Nothing real ever is. Landon spent the afternoon with Garrett walking the Eastern pasture, 300 acres of rolling grass and scattered timber, bisected by a creek that ran good water from the snowmelt and would need monitoring in drought years. There were 2 sections of fence that needed attention, a spring box that had gone unmaintained and was partially collapsed, and a small line cabin in the northeast corner that was structurally sound but had been empty long enough to collect the specific kind of disorder that empty buildings collect. Garrett walked the land without commentary, letting Landon look, answering questions when asked. The spring box, Landon said. How long has it been down? 3 years. I've been getting water to that section from the main creek. Fixing that's the first priority. Agreed. The northeast timber. Is that a good wind shelter in winter, or does it channel? Shelters. The ridge behind it breaks the northwest wind. That corner of the pasture is the warmest spot on the property in January. Landon filed that away. He was already building the layout in his head, where the cattle would summer, where they'd need supplemental feeding in hard winters, where the fence needed reinforcing before he put animals on it. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon when they came back to the yard. Vivian was at the south fence with Colfax, working the section she'd identified that morning. They'd made good progress. 3 posts reset and new wire on the east side. She was driving a staple when Landon and Garrett came into view, and she looked up, read whatever she read in the 2 of them walking together, and went back to the staple. Garrett said, I'll leave you to it, and went inside. Landon walked over to the fence. He picked up the wire stretcher from the ground and moved to the next section without being asked. Colfax glanced at him once, registered something, and went to work on the far end. They worked for an hour in the late afternoon light, and the conversation was about the fence, wire tension, post depth, the particular soft soil in the low spot that was going to be a recurring problem and probably needed a gravel pack to address it. When they were done, Colfax gathered the tools and took them to the barn. Landon and Vivian stood at the finished section of fence. He made you an offer, she said. He did. You accepted. Yes. She looked at the fence line, running clean and tight across the south pasture now. That section's been bothering me for 2 years, she said. Something about finishing it feels right. Good work does that, Landon said. She turned to look at him. The light was going golden and long now, the way it goes in Wyoming in April in the late afternoon, and it was doing more things to the color of her eyes, and he was running out of ways to not account for this. I want to say something, she said, and I don't want you to be careful about responding. All right. I'm 22 years old and I know my own mind, she said. My father's a good man and I respect his judgment, but the choice about my life is mine. I've known that since I was 16, and I know it better now. Whatever he's offered you, whatever you build on that eastern pasture, that doesn't have anything to do with me unless I say it does. She looked at him directly. I'm saying it does. Landon held her gaze. I'm glad, he said. Is that all you have? No, he said, but I'm going to do this correctly, which means talking to your father again before I say the rest of it to you. Vivian looked at him for a moment, and then something in her expression relaxed. Not into softness exactly, but into the particular ease of someone who has been watching carefully and has seen what they needed to see. All right, she said. Then do it correctly. She picked up her hat from the fence post where she'd hung it. Supper's at 6. You're staying. She walked toward the house. He watched her go, and then he looked at the fence line they'd repaired, running straight and tight across the slope, and then at the eastern pasture beyond it where 300 acres of good grass was waiting for spring. He had $16 in his saddlebag. He had a mare who needed extra grain. He had a lease agreement on good land, a deal on 20 head of starting cattle, and a conversation still to have with Garrett Ashcroft about something more personal than grazing rights. He also had, and had had since October, a letter in his saddlebag from a woman who had never once asked how he was doing, only what he was doing, and had understood without being told that those were the same question. He went to put Cora up for the night. He talked to Garrett that evening, after supper, when Vivian had gone upstairs, and the cook had cleared the table, and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a working ranch at night. The horses in the barn, the wind low outside, the stove in the main room putting out steady heat. Garrett was in the office again, going over a ledger, and he looked up when Landon came to the doorway. I figured you'd come back in tonight, Garrett said. I want to ask permission to court your daughter, Landon said. Formally, I should have said it that way in October, but He paused. I was trying to be careful about getting ahead of things. Garrett set down his pen. He didn't do anything theatrical about it, didn't lean back in his chair with his arms crossed, didn't make a production of the silence that followed. He just set down his pen and looked at Landon with those pale eyes that had been reading people for 30 years. She already told me, Garrett said. Told you what? That she'd said it does, to you, at the south fence. He looked at the ledger, not reading it, just looking at it. She didn't ask me. She told me. That's Vivian. Something in his face moved, that almost smile that never quite arrived. Her mother was the same way, made decisions and then told me about them afterward, once they were settled. Is that a problem? Landon asked. No, Garrett said. It never was with her mother either. He picked up his pen again, not to write, just to hold. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to understand I'm not saying it as a warning or a condition. I'm saying it because it's true, and you should know it. All right. Vivian is the most capable person I know, Garrett said. Not the most capable woman, the most capable person. She can read a ledger, manage a land negotiation, build a fence, doctor a sick animal, and run the household books simultaneously, and she does all of it without requiring anyone to notice. She has been doing significant work on this ranch since she was 16 years old, and a great deal of the reason this operation runs as well as it does is her. He set the pen down again. She has also spent the last 6 years watching men come to this ranch and see her face and her father's land and her mother's furniture and think they were seeing the whole picture. They were not seeing the whole picture. Landon said, I know. I don't think you know yet, Garrett said, not unkindly. I think you know it better than the others did. But you've had 20 minutes at a social and 11 letters and an afternoon on a fence line. There is more to her than that. I'm aware there's more to her than that, Landon said. That's part of what I'm here for. Garrett looked at him for a long moment. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small piece of paper and slid it across to Landon without explanation. Landon picked it up. It was a letter dated the previous November, 4 months into the winter. It was in Vivian's handwriting. It read, Papa, don't answer this in a letter, just know it. I've been thinking about the cowboy you sent to Ellis Calloway's place, and I've decided I'm not going to pretend I haven't. He asked good questions at the Clearwater Social. His letters are honest without trying to be impressive. I don't know what you're thinking about him, and I'm not asking. I just want you to know what I'm thinking, because you promised you'd always want to know. That was all. Landon read it twice and set it back on the desk. November, he said. November, Garrett confirmed. The same month you went into a frozen creek for a $15 steer. Landon looked at the window, which was dark now, the yard invisible behind his own reflection. You have my permission, Garrett said. And for whatever it's worth, you have my good opinion. The rest is between you and her. Thank you, Landon said. He meant it simply, and Garrett received it simply, and that was the whole of that conversation, which was exactly the right length. The spring came in fast after the first week of April, the way Wyoming spring sometimes does when it finally decides to arrive. Not gradually, but all at once. The snow melt running hard down the creek, the grass coming up green in the lower pastures before the upper ones had shed their last crust. The eastern pasture that was now Landon's responsibility for the next 5 years came to life in increments that he walked every other day, checking the creek flow, assessing the grass density, identifying the sections that would need the most management. The spring box in the northeast corner took 4 days to repair. He did it mostly alone, though Vivian helped on the second and third day, and on the fourth day Colfax came over for the heavy lifting when they had to reseat the stone collection basin. When the water ran clear and true from the repaired box into the trough Landon had set below it, Vivian stood back and looked at it with the expression of someone watching a mechanical thing do what it's supposed to do. Not wonder exactly, but a particular satisfaction. My father has been hauling water to that corner for 3 years, she said. He mentioned. He's going to say something about this. He already saw it, Landon said. He walked the pasture with me this morning. He said, and I'm going to give you his exact words. That'll do. Vivian looked at him. That is extremely high praise from my father. I know. He said it the same way he says everything. She made a sound that was close to a laugh and turned back to the spring box. The trough's level is wrong, she said. It needs to come up about 2 inches on the east side or it'll overflow in high flow. She was right. He shimmed the east leg with 2 flat stones from the creek while she held the trough steady. And when they released it, the water distributed evenly and the overflow notch on the west side did its job. They were good at working together. That was the thing Landon noticed in April and continued noticing through May, that there was no adjustment period between them, no diplomatic navigation of whose idea was better or who knew more about what. She knew things he didn't, and she said so without making a point of it, and he knew things she didn't, and he said so the same way, and between the two of them the work moved faster and went better than either of them would have managed alone. It was not always comfortable. She had opinions that she held hard, and twice in May they argued about something. Once about the rotation schedule for the pasture sections, which she wanted to run shorter intervals than Landon thought the grass density supported. And once about the fence line on the western boundary, which she thought needed full replacement, and he thought needed targeted repair. They argued both times without either of them backing down for the sake of peace, and both times they eventually found a third position that was better than either original one, and neither of them said anything about how the argument had resolved. She didn't defer to him because he was the one leasing the land. He didn't defer to her because she was Garrett's daughter. They argued until the argument was over, and then they went back to work. Garrett observed all of this from what seemed like a deliberate distance, close enough to be present, far enough to be unintrusive. He was doing what he'd said he would do. Watching, without engineering. Once, in mid-May, he came to the eastern pasture where Landon was sorting through the 20 head of starting cattle, assessing conditions, marking the ones that needed attention before they went to summer grass. And he stood at the fence for about 10 minutes watching Landon work the animals through the sorting area alone. You're efficient with them, Garrett said when Landon came to the fence. I've been doing this since I was 14. Some men spend their whole lives doing something and never get efficient at it. Garrett rested his arms on the top rail. How are you reading them? 6 of the steers are good. They'll finish well if the summer grass is what you say it is. 2 of the young cows need more condition before I breed them, so I'll wait until next spring. The older cow. He looked back at the animal in question, a deep red creature with one crooked horn who was standing at the far end of the sorting area, looking unimpressed with the whole proceeding. She's going to be difficult to manage, but she's worth the trouble. She's got a quality about her. Garrett looked at the cow. Her name is Constance, he said. She's been on this property for 11 years. My wife named her. Landon looked at him. I sent her with the 20 because she needed a new situation, Garrett said. She's been running with the main herd and making trouble. She's the kind of animal that does better when she has a purpose. I can work with that, Landon said. I thought you probably could, Garrett said, and walked back to the main yard without further comment. The 20 head went to the eastern pasture's upper section in the second week of May, after Landon had walked every foot of the fence to satisfy himself it would hold. He put Cora in the lean-to pasture attached to the line cabin, the cabin that had been empty for years, which he'd spent 3 evenings in April cleaning out and making habitable enough to use during the busy seasons, replacing 2 rotten floorboards and re-chinking the worst sections of the log walls. He didn't sleep in it yet. He was still sleeping in the room the cook had prepared for him in the main house, a small room at the back with a single window looking east, where the light came in early and woke him at 4 in the morning whether he wanted to be awake or not, which suited him fine. He'd sleep in the line cabin when he needed to be closer to the cattle for a specific reason. For now, the arrangement was what it was. What it was a household. And he knew it, and Vivian knew it, and Garrett knew it, and no one said anything about it. Because in 1884 in Wyoming Territory, you didn't need to say things that were already clear. Cornelius Hatch came back in June. He didn't come to the eastern pasture. He came to the main house mid-morning on a Thursday, with his man behind him the same as always. Landon was in the south pasture working on a water crossing that had washed out in the spring melt when Colfax rode over from the yard and told him. Hatch is at the house, Colfax said. Has been for 20 minutes. Miss Vivian asked me to let you know. Landon set down the shovel he was using and looked at the crossing, which was half done. He looked at Colfax. What does he want? Don't know. Mr. Ashcroft's in there with him. Landon washed his hands in the creek and walked to the main house. He could hear Hatch's voice before he reached the porch. Not the words, but the tone. The particular register of a man who is accustomed to the pressure of his own voice being enough. He went in without knocking because the door was open. Hatch was in the main room, not the office, the main room, which meant Garrett had not taken him to the office, which meant Garrett was managing the distance deliberately. He was standing with his hat in his hands, which was a concession of some kind, and his man was outside on the porch. Garrett was standing near the fireplace with his arms at his sides. Vivian was in the doorway to the kitchen. All 3 of them looked at Landon when he came in. Hatch's eyes went over him once. The work clothes, the mud on his boots, the general appearance of a man who had been building a water crossing all morning. You're the cowboy, he said. Landon Mercer, Landon said. He'd said it to Hatch once before, in a different yard, and it had meant nothing to him then. He wasn't sure it meant anything now either. I've heard the name since then, Hatch said. You've taken a lease on Ashcroft's eastern pasture. That's right. Hatch looked at Garrett. I'll say what I came to say, Ashcroft. I had an interest in that eastern pasture. I made that interest known before this arrangement was made. I think I deserve the opportunity to present terms. You had opportunity, Garrett said. We've had 2 conversations about that land in the past 3 years. Your proposed terms both times were not terms I was going to accept. Times change. I'd have been open to renegotiation. The land is leased, Garrett said. That's the end of that conversation. Hatch's jaw tightened slightly. He looked at Landon again, a different kind of look this time. The calculation of a man deciding what category to put a person in. 20 head and a line cabin, he said. That's what Ashcroft started you with. More or less, Landon said. That's a thin foundation. It'll do, Landon said. The eastern pasture needs significant fence work on the western boundary. Needs a new spring box. Spring box is done, Landon said. Fence work is scheduled for July. Hatch went quiet for a moment. He was recalculating something. Landon could see it happening, the way you can sometimes watch a card player adjust when the hand goes differently than expected. You're also courting his daughter, Hatch said. He said it like a move, like the information was something he'd been holding. The room went very still. Garrett said, That's a private matter. It's a public matter when it involves business arrangements that affect the territory, Hatch said. He'd recovered his register, the calm, commanding tone, but something underneath it had shifted. An arrangement where the rancher leases land at favorable terms and grants courtship rights to the same man has the appearance of a private transaction dressed up as sound business. The lease terms are fair market, Garrett said. So you say. So any assessor in the territory would say if you'd like to test the question. Hatch looked at Vivian. You're a beautiful woman, he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement being deployed. Your father has been overly sentimental about your future. That sentimentality is going to cost him. You've said something like that before, Vivian said. Her voice was even. I thought about it quite a bit. And I think you confuse sentiment with strategy, she said. My father has spent 30 years building this operation through careful decisions about land, cattle, and the people he does business with. His decision about this arrangement is not sentimental. It's exactly the kind of decision that has made this ranch what it is. She looked at him with those green eyes that didn't move. You've been trying to acquire pieces of this property for 15 years through various means. You haven't managed it. That might be worth examining from your side of the equation. Hatch's face did something that wasn't quite anger. It was a kind of recalibration. He was seeing her properly, possibly for the first time. Miss Ashcroft, he said, with a deliberateness that told Landon he was reaching for control of the conversation he'd just lost. I'm done with this, Garrett said. Not loudly, just with a finality that filled the room. You've had your say. The land is leased, the arrangement is fair, and my family's private matters are not your concern. I'd like you to leave my property. Hatch held the room for one more beat, the pause of a man deciding whether to escalate. Landon watched him the same way he'd watched him in the Callaway yard in February, with the specific attention of someone choosing where to stand. Hatch put on his hat. I'll see myself out, he said. He looked at Landon once more on his way to the door, a look that said this conversation had an additional chapter. And then he went out, and his boots were loud on the porch boards, and then the sound of horses moving, and then nothing. The three of them stood in the main room. Vivian let out a slow breath. He's going to try something else, she said. Yes, Garrett said. What? Landon asked. Garrett moved to the window and watched until Hatch was through the gate and gone from sight. He'll go after the eastern pasture lease through the county records. He'll claim there's a prior encumbrance, some old arrangement, or claim he can manufacture paperwork for. He's done it before in the territory with less sophisticated targets. Can he make it stick? Not if we've documented the lease properly and filed it correctly. Garrett turned from the window. Which we have. I had the territorial recorder certify it the week after we signed. He looked at Landon with something in his expression that was not quite satisfaction, but was close to it. He didn't know that. He came here today to rattle the foundation and see what shifted. Nothing shifted. Landon nodded slowly. He looked at Vivian. You were right, he said. About which part? About him confusing sentiment with strategy. That was the right thing to say at the right moment. Something flickered across her face. I've been thinking about what to say to him since November, she said, when he made his speech at the social about a woman's opinion being a courtesy. She looked at the door he'd gone out of. I picked better ground this time. They stood there a moment, the three of them, in the room where 6 months earlier Hatch had dropped papers on the dining table and told Garrett his daughter didn't get a vote. The room looked the same. The furniture was the same. The light through the windows was the same late morning light. But the room had different people in it now. One additional person, standing in the doorway in work clothes with mud on his boots, who had been here 6 months and was not going anywhere. Hatch didn't come back that summer. He didn't file a challenge to the lease through the county records. He didn't approach the bank about the Ashcroft accounts, which Landon had half expected him to attempt. He ran his 50 head on the Callaway East pasture that summer. Ellis had held to the original terms. And he was seen twice at the county seat on business that Garrett's contacts described as routine. He wasn't gone. Men like Hatch didn't go anywhere. But he'd looked at the situation and done the arithmetic, and found that the margins weren't in his favor, and he'd adjusted accordingly, the way men who survive a long time in a competitive territory learn to adjust. In July, the fence work on the western boundary of the eastern pasture became the main project. It was 10 days of physical work. pulling old posts, digging new holes, stretching wire. In the summer heat that in Wyoming is a different animal than winter cold, but no less demanding. Landon did most of it himself, with one of Garrett's hands helping on the heavy stretching days. Vivian came out 4 of those days and worked sections alongside them. She was better at fence work than she let on. On the 3rd day, she pulled a wire section tighter than Landon had, without being asked and without comment, and he looked at it and didn't say anything about how it was better than his, and she didn't look at him while she drove the staple. They just moved on to the next section. One morning in the middle of the fence project, when they were working the far northwest corner and the main house was a mile away across the pasture, she said without preamble, "My mother used to say that the way to know a man is to work alongside him, not to watch him work." Alongside him. Landon drove a staple. Smart woman. She was. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She would have liked you. He didn't say anything to that. He wasn't sure what to say, and she wasn't asking him to say anything. She was just saying it, in the way she sometimes said things that were complete in themselves. She died in the fall, Vivian said, 1875. There was an illness that moved through this part of the territory. Several families lost people. She wrapped the wire end and moved it back. I was 13. My father... She stopped and started again. He kept the ranch going. He never stopped. Some men fall apart when they lose the person they built everything with. He didn't fall apart. He just got very quiet. He's still quiet, Landon said. He is. But it's a different kind of quiet than it was then. She looked across the pasture toward the main house. He told me once, when I was about 17, that the reason he kept going after my mother died was that he'd made her something out of this land, and the only way to honor that was to keep making it. She turned back to the wire. I've been thinking about that a lot this spring. Why this spring? She looked at him. Because I've been watching you do the same thing, make something. She held his gaze for a moment. It's the right instinct. He didn't respond to that directly, because the thing he wanted to say was too large for a fence line in the morning, and he was still a man who understood picking the right ground. But he remembered it. He remembered all of it, the way she said the things she said, without decoration, like she'd taken the thought and removed everything from it except what was true, and then said that. He had not known many people who talked like that. He was not going to pretend he took it lightly. In August, Ellis Calloway came down from the North Fork to the Ashcroft Ranch for the first time since Landon had left him in April. He came on a Saturday, which Landon later figured he'd timed deliberately, arriving at mid-morning when the work had a natural break in it. He tied his horse at the hitching post and came through the gate and found Landon coming out of the eastern pasture with a tally book in his hand. They shook hands in the yard. Ellis looked better than he'd looked in April, more filled out, the dark circles gone, with the particular ease of a man who has made it through the first hard thing and knows now that he can. He looked at the pasture fence, which was new and clean and tight. He looked at the line cabin in the distance. He looked at the 20 head visible in the upper section. You've been busy, he said. It's been a full summer. Constance giving you trouble? You know Constance. She went through our south fence twice when she was young, Ellis said, before Mr. Ashcroft took her back. My father said she was more fence than cattle. He looked at the pasture. Is she? She went through once in May, Landon said. I fixed the section she went through and moved her to a different rotation, and she's been fine since. Ellis nodded. He looked at the main house, then at Landon. I wrote to Vivian in June, he said. She wrote back. She mentioned. She said you were building the water crossing in the south pasture. It's done now. She said it was a good crossing. Ellis looked at him with a directness that was the thing Landon had liked about him from the beginning. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. I owe you a debt, Ellis said. Not for the winter only, for how you handled the hatch situation, for writing to Mr. Ashcroft, for not making me feel like I needed saving. You didn't need saving, Landon said. You needed information and someone to spell you when the work got too heavy for one person. Still, you'd have figured it out, Landon said. Slower, maybe, but you'd have gotten there. Ellis looked at the tally book in Landon's hand. What are you running? 22 head now. 2 of the steers I picked up in a trade with Garrett's main herd. He had some doubles on his numbers. Good grass up here for summer finishing? As good as anywhere I've seen. Ellis looked at the upper pasture with an assessing eye. I brought 93 through, he said, plus those 2 calves in March, both still going. I branded 40 head in June. He paused. First branding I've done alone. How'd it go? Slower than it should have. He almost smiled. But it got done. They walked the eastern pasture for the better part of an hour, Ellis asking questions, Landon answering, both of them talking about grass management and water sources, and the particular challenges of this elevation and exposure. Ellis knew mountain ranching in a way that Landon didn't, had grown up with it, and he said things about the fall preparations that Landon filed away carefully because they were things he needed to know. At noon, Vivian came out from the main house with a tin of food for the midday meal, and the 3 of them sat on the fence of the eastern pasture in the summer heat, and ate and talked. And it was the most natural thing in the world. Or it looked like that, which meant the work that had made it feel that way was invisible. The way all good work eventually becomes invisible when it's finished. After Ellis left in the afternoon, heading back up the north road, Vivian sat on the fence a while longer and watched the dust of his horse settle. He's going to be one of the best ranchers in this part of the territory, she said. I know, Landon said. He knows it too. You can see it in how he carries himself now. He earned it. She looked at him. So did you, for your part in it. She said it plainly, without emphasis, the way she said things she considered settled. He looked at the pasture. The cattle were in the upper section, moving slowly through the afternoon heat, and Constance was among them, the red cow with the crooked horn, who had been on this property for 11 years, and who stood slightly apart from the others the way she always did, watching everything. He'd been here 5 months now. He had a leased pasture with 22 head on it. He had a fence that was right, and a spring box that ran clean, and a water crossing that didn't wash out. He had 11 letters in his saddlebag, and a woman sitting on the fence beside him who had driven her first staple at 14 years old and hadn't stopped working since. He had something to say. He'd been choosing the ground for it since April. Vivian, he said. I know, she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was watching the cattle. You don't know what I'm going to say. I know enough of it. He turned to look at her. She kept watching the cattle for a moment, then turned and looked at him, and she had the expression of someone who has been patient about something for a very specific amount of time and has decided the time is up. I'd like to marry you, he said, not because of the lease, not because of your father's good opinion, because of 11 letters and 20 minutes at the Clearwater Social and every morning since April on this fence line. Because of the way you fixed the spring trough without being asked, and the way you argued with me about the pasture rotation until we found a better answer, and the way you said your mother would have liked me without expecting anything back from it. He paused. I don't have much yet. I have what's in this pasture, and what's in my saddlebag, and what I know how to do. That's what I'm offering. She was quiet for a moment. You're leaving out the $16, she said. I have more than that now. How much more? $23. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something he hadn't seen her do before. She laughed. Not politely, not with restraint, but a real laugh, sudden and genuine, the kind that changes a person's whole face. $7, she said. In 5 months. It's been an expensive spring, he said. She was still smiling when the laugh settled. She looked at the pasture again. Yes, she said. Yes, you'll marry me, or yes, it's been an expensive spring. Both, she said. Obviously both. He looked at the cattle. Constance had moved to the near section of the fence and was watching them with the particular focused attention she brought to everything, and Landon had the thought, unreasonable but persistent, that the old cow was entirely aware of what had just happened. We need to tell your father, he said. He already knows, Vivian said. I told him in June. Landon looked at her. You told him in June. I told him I was going to say yes when you asked. I didn't want him to be surprised. She picked up her hat from the fence post. He wasn't surprised. Was he? He said he'd been waiting for you to ask since April. She put her hat on. He also said that when you finally did ask, he hoped you'd pick better ground than a fence post. Landon looked at the fence post they were sitting on. It's a well-built fence. It is, she agreed. You built it. She slid down from the fence and started toward the house. He sat there on the fence rail in the August afternoon with 22 head on good grass in the eastern pasture and a spring box that ran clean and a water crossing that held, and he thought about the Clearwater Social and the $16 and the 8 miles up the North Road in October and the frozen creek in November, and the barn roof and the letters and the south fence and the corner post on the north slope and the spring morning when he'd ridden down off the mountain thinking about a conversation he'd been rationing for 6 months and now didn't have to ration anymore. He sat there for a while. Then he got down from the fence and went to find Garrett Ashcroft, who was in the barn looking at the condition of a mare's left front shoe and who looked up when Landon came in and said, before Landon could speak, "She told me you'd finally ask today." "She told me she told you in June," Landon said. "She tells me things in advance," Garrett said. "It's a habit she has." He went back to the mare's hoof. "The answer is yes, if you're still asking." "I'm still asking." "Then yes." Garrett set the hoof down and straightened. "She'll want a simple wedding. Don't let anyone talk her into anything larger than she wants. She's very easy to mistake for someone who wants what everyone else wants, and she doesn't." "I know that," Landon said. "I know you do." Garrett picked up a brush from the rack and went to work on the mare. "Fall," he said. "After gather. The work should be settled by October." "October is good," Landon said. Garrett nodded without looking up. Outside, the August sun was laying across the yard and the pasture and the new fence and the 22 head on the good summer grass. And somewhere in the house, a woman with chestnut hair and a particular way of saying what she meant was probably going through the ledger books, or checking on the supply inventory, or doing any one of 100 things that needed doing, because that was what she did, and the ranch kept going because of it, and she didn't require anyone to notice. And Landon noticed. He noticed, and he went back to work. The fall gather came in the last week of September, and it was the kind of work that left no room for anything else. 4 days of riding every section of the Ashcroft Range and the eastern pasture, pushing cattle down from the summer elevations before the first serious cold arrived, sorting, counting, making the decisions about which animals would winter and which would go to market. Landon ran his eastern pasture gather on the first day, alone, moving the 22 head down to the lower section where the winter grass was better and the wind shelter from the northeast timber would count for something. He did it in 8 hours, which was faster than it should have been for one man, but Cora was good at this work and so was he, and by late afternoon the cattle were where they needed to be and the count was right, and he came back to the main yard with the particular tiredness that comes from a full day of focused work done correctly. Garrett's main gather ran the following 3 days, with 6 hands working the range in sections, and Landon rode with them on the second and third days, as the arrangement specified. Separate wages, separate from the lease, the 2 businesses kept distinct. He worked the north slope section on the second day and the upper timber boundary on the third, and both days he was back at the main yard by dark. And both evenings Vivienne had supper waiting, and the 3 of them ate together with the comfortable quiet of people who have been eating together long enough to have stopped trying to fill the silences. On the evening of the 4th day, when the gather was done and the numbers were tallied, and Garrett sat at the dining table with his ledger going over the final count, he looked up at Landon across the table and said, 94 head to market, best fall I've had since 1879. The summer grass was right, Landon said. The summer management was right, Garrett corrected. He went back to his ledger. October 15th, he said, not looking up. That's a Saturday, Vivienne said from the kitchen doorway. I know it's a Saturday, Garrett said. That's why I said it. That was the whole of the wedding planning conversation that Landon was present for. He found out later, from Colfax of all people, that Garrett had sent letters to 6 families in the territory 2 weeks earlier, and that the minister from Clearwater had been contacted, and that the cook had already made arrangements with a woman in town about a cake. All of this had been organized without a word to Landon, which he understood was not indifference, but its opposite. It was Garrett's way of taking care of something, quietly and completely, so that no one had to ask for it. He mentioned this to Vivienne. That's how he shows it, she said. He doesn't say much. He just makes sure things are handled. I know, Landon said. I'm not complaining. I know you're not. She looked at him. Are you nervous? No, he said. Then honestly, a little. She seemed to find that acceptable. Good, she said. Overconfidence at a wedding is its own kind of problem. October came in cool and clear, the aspens on the north slope turning gold and the lower pasture grass going to the particular amber color that Wyoming grassland turns in autumn, a color that looks like it should be warm but is actually the color of something ending. Landon checked the winter preparations on the eastern pasture every day that first week, the spring box, the fence, the wind shelter conditions in the northeast corner, the hay supply he'd been stacking through September. He went over everything twice, the way you do when you're about to not be watching for a few days and you need to be certain you've thought of what might go wrong. Ellis Calloway came down from the North Fork on the 14th, the day before the wedding, and tied his horse at the Ashcroft hitching post at mid-morning and found Landon in the eastern pasture checking the hay. You're going to check it again tomorrow morning too, Ellis said, before the wedding, and then again after. Probably, Landon said. It's ready. Stop looking at it. Landon set down the hay fork. Ellis looked good. Better than August, which had itself been better than April. He'd filled out properly now. The narrow shoulders of the previous spring replaced with the frame of a man doing sustained physical work on his own land. His hands had lost that recently roughened look and just looked like a working rancher's hands. How are the cattle? Landon asked. 94 going into winter, plus the calves from spring, both solid. Ellis leaned on the fence. I fixed the East Ridge section that was giving trouble. Dug out the post bases like you showed me, packed the gravel, reset them all. All of them? Everyone in that section, while I was at it. He looked at Landon's cattle in the lower section of the pasture, Constance visible near the water trough, watching them with her usual scrutiny. She's still here, Ellis said. She went through the fence once in May, hasn't since. My father used to say she was the smartest animal he'd ever worked with, which was why she was the most trouble. Ellis watched Constance for a moment. She's testing you. She goes through once to see what happens. What happened? I fixed the section and moved her rotation. And she stopped. She stopped. Ellis nodded slowly. She just needed to know you were paying attention. He pushed off the fence. My father said that about her too. They walked back to the main yard together, and Landon found himself thinking about the 11 letters in his saddlebag and the frozen creek and the barn roof and the February morning when Hatch had appeared in the Calloway yard, and the way Ellis had stood his ground without shaking, or had shaken invisibly, which amounted to the same thing from the outside. A year ago they had been strangers. Now there was a shorthand between them, the particular vocabulary of two people who have been through something hard in the same place at the same time. I want to say something, Ellis said when they reached the yard gate. Say it. You came up in October with $16 and no wages, and stayed through April for no reason I could see except that the work needed doing. He looked at Landon directly, the way he always did when he was saying something he'd thought about. I've been thinking about that for a year. I've been trying to figure out what I would have done for you if the situation were reversed, whether I would have done the same. Would you have? Landon asked. I don't know, Ellis said. That's the honest answer. I'd like to think so. But you set a bar that's hard to be certain about. He paused. What I know is that I intend to find out. Whether there's something I can do for someone else the way you did it for me, the way Ashcroft did it for you, in a different form. He looked at the main house. That seems like the point of the whole thing. Landon looked at him for a moment. That is the point, he said. Ellis nodded, satisfied, and went to find somewhere to stable his horse. The wedding was on a Saturday, the 15th of October, 1884, and the sky over the Ashcroft Ranch was the particular blue of a Wyoming autumn day. Not summer blue, which is soft and hazy, but the hard, clear blue of a sky that has been scoured clean by the first cold fronts of the season, the kind of blue that has no bottom to it and goes up forever. The aspens on the north slope were at their fullest gold, and the light that came through them and across the yard was the color of something that knows it won't last but isn't sorry about it. 12 families had come. That was more than Landon had expected, and exactly what Garrett had planned for, which meant there were enough people to fill the yard in front of the porch and make it feel like something, without it becoming the kind of large occasion that Vivian would have managed carefully and not particularly wanted. The Clearwater minister was a compact man in a dark coat who had clearly been doing this a long time and knew that what a wedding ceremony needed was mostly to stay out of its own way. He kept it short and direct, which was right. Vivian wore ivory. The dress was simple, no elaborate trim, no extensive bustle, just good fabric cut well, the kind of dress that served the person wearing it rather than announcing itself. Her hair was up, but not severely, and she wore no jewelry except a small brooch at her collar that had been her mother's. She stood beside Landon in front of the porch steps with the same directness she brought to every other thing. Present, clear-eyed, not performing anything. She was the most beautiful woman Landon had ever seen. He had thought this since October of the previous year and had been careful about thinking it too often, and now he stopped being careful about it. He was aware that he looked like what he was, a working cowboy in his best shirt, which was not a remarkable shirt, his hat held in his hands because this was the one situation that called for no hat, his boots clean but recognizably the boots of a man who wore them to work. He had not tried to look like something other than what he was, and Vivian had not asked him to, and the people gathered in the yard could look at him and read him plain, and he was comfortable with that. They said what needed to be said. The minister said what needed to be said. Garrett stood to the side of the gathered people, not in front and not behind, his hat in his hands, and his expression the expression of a man who has held a great deal inside for a great many years and is holding it still, but differently, with more room in it than before. When it was done and done correctly, the gathered people made the sounds people make and came forward, and Ellis shook Landon's hand so hard it was briefly uncomfortable, and several men Landon didn't know well came and introduced themselves in the way people do at weddings when they've decided a person is worth knowing. 3 of them asked about the Eastern pasture lease. One of them asked about the cattle he'd taken to market in early October, which had gone at good prices because they were in good condition, because the summer grass had been managed well. 2 men who had called on Vivian over the past several years were present, because the territory was not large and because Garrett had not excluded anyone from the invitation and probably wouldn't have known how to. One of them, a rancher named Aldous Price, who had land east of the county seat and who had come twice to the Ashcroft Ranch with expensive gifts and gone away politely refused, came and shook Landon's hand and looked at him with the expression of a man doing an honest accounting. "She made the right choice," Price said. He said it without bitterness and without qualification, just as a straight assessment. "Thank you," Landon said. "I mean it as a fact, not a compliment," Price said. Then he went to get something to eat, and that was the whole of that. Cornelius Hatch was not present. He had not been invited, and even if he had been, Landon did not think he would have come, because Hatch was a man who measured his attendance at things by whether his presence gave him advantage, and there was no advantage here for him. The eastern pasture was leased, and the lease was filed, and the wedding was done, and the shape of the situation was clear enough that attempting to alter it would cost more than leaving it alone. The cook had made a cake that was better than it needed to be, and the food was good and plentiful, and by mid-afternoon the yard had the easy sound of a gathering that has relaxed past formality into something more like a community taking stock of itself. Landon stood with Vivian in the center of it and watched the people and listened to the conversations that came to them and went, and at some point he realized that he was no longer a stranger here, not because of the wedding exactly, but because of the year before it, the accumulated weight of showing up every day and doing the work, and being recognizable to the people who paid attention to such things. Garrett came to stand beside them in the late afternoon, when the crowd had thinned some and the light was going amber across the yard. He stood on Landon's left and looked at the people still gathered and the aspens on the slope throwing gold light across the grass. He didn't say anything for a long moment. The 3 of them stood together in the way that had become familiar over the summer, not requiring conversation to be comfortable. Then Garrett said, "Your father was a hard man, you said." He hadn't said that. Bryce Alderman's letter had said it. Landon understood that Garrett was being direct about the source. "He was," Landon said. "I've thought about that over the summer. What it takes for a person to become what you've become, coming from that." He was still looking at the yard, not at Landon. "Some men get hard from hard fathers. Some men decide to be different. The decision alone doesn't do it. I've seen men decide to be different, and then become their fathers anyway, slowly, without noticing. The ones who actually manage it, he paused. It takes a particular kind of sustained intention, over years. I know, Landon said. I know you know, Garrett said. I'm saying I see it. That was all. He walked away toward a group of ranchers who had come to speak with him about the fall cattle prices, and Vivian watched him go with the particular expression she had for her father: respect and exasperation, and love in equal measure, the combination that only exists between people who know each other completely and have made their peace with what they know. He's been working up to saying that since April, she said. It was worth waiting for, Landon said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. Sometimes things are. The guests were gone by evening. The cook and a woman who'd come to help cleaned up the yard, and Ellis helped carry tables back inside and stack them, because Ellis was the kind of person who did that without being asked. And then he shook hands again and got his horse and rode north up the road toward the foothills, toward his own ranch and his own cattle and his own preparations for winter. And Landon watched him go and felt something he didn't try to name because naming it would have made it smaller. That night, with the yard quiet and the house settled, Landon sat on the porch in the dark for a while. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and there was frost coming. The air had that smell to it. And somewhere in the eastern pasture, Constance was standing in the dark watching things, because that was what she did. He sat there and let himself think about the whole of it, not in order, not as a story, but the way you think about something when it's no longer in front of you, but has become the ground you're standing on. The $16. The Clearwater Social. The 8 miles up the North Road with October coming down off the mountains. The barn roof. The creek. Ellis's face on the morning they counted 91 head. The 11 letters. The corner post on the north slope. The south fence. The spring box. The argument about pasture rotation. The fence post at a wedding. He didn't feel that he'd proven anything. That was the thing he'd come to understand somewhere in the middle of all of it, that the proving was not the point, had never been the point, and that men who went through hard things in order to prove something usually found that the thing they'd proved was thinner than they'd expected, because the proving was oriented toward an audience, and audiences don't sustain you. What sustained you was the work, the actual work, done right for the right reasons, in the specific places where it needed to be done, the steer in the frozen creek, the cross brace on the barn roof, the spring box, level now, running clean water. These things had their own weight that didn't depend on anyone seeing them. He had not gone up to Ellis Calloway's mountain ranch to prove himself to Garrett Ashcroft. He had gone because the work needed doing and because the work was real. That Garrett had been paying attention was not nothing. It mattered, and he wasn't going to pretend it didn't. But if Garrett had not been paying attention, the barn roof would still need to be sound, and the cattle would still need to come through the winter, and Ellis would still need to know how to read the sky. The door opened behind him, and Vivian came out, pulling a coat around her shoulders, and sat in the other chair. "You're going to check the eastern pasture in the morning," she said. "Probably before dawn," he admitted. "I know." She looked at the dark where the pasture was. "I'm going to come." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She pulled the coat tighter. "There's something I've been meaning to look at on the north water line. I want to check it before the ground freezes." He almost smiled. "You've been meaning to look at it since Thursday." They sat in the dark a while longer, the frost coming, the aspens on the slope invisible now but present. The cattle in the eastern pasture distributed the way he'd calculated they should be distributed. The spring box running clean in the northeast corner, the fence tight from the western boundary work in July. "Can I tell you something?" Vivian said. "Yes?" I was not going to say yes to anyone. She said it looking at the dark, not at him. "I need you to understand that. It's not that I was waiting for the right person and you arrived. It's that I had decided quite specifically that the version of a life people kept offering me, the correct marriage to the correct man with the correct property, was not a life I was willing to accept. I had a plan. I was going to run this ranch with my father until he got old, and then run it alone, or with someone I chose on my own terms, in my own time, or not at all." Landon was quiet, and then a cowboy with $16 came to my father's house and asked to speak to him about his daughter, she said, "and my father told me at supper that night, and something in how he told it Something about how the man had answered his questions made me go upstairs and not be able to read my book. She paused. And then I went to the Clearwater Social in November, and you weren't there. And I thought about the 20 minutes we'd talked in July more than I had any reasonable justification for. I was in the mountains in November, he said. I know. I helped pack the supply sledge. She finally looked at him. What I'm telling you is that nothing about this was inevitable. I wasn't a woman waiting to be chosen. I chose. I want you to know that clearly, because in a few years people will tell the story of how Garrett Ashcroft's beautiful daughter married the penniless cowboy who proved himself worthy. And that version of the story will be about you. About what you did. And that's not wrong. What you did was real, and it mattered. But I was also doing something. I was watching carefully and making a decision, and the decision was mine. I know that, Landon said. I know you know, she said. I'm saying it anyway because it needs to be said. He looked at her. You chose well, he said. She looked back at him with those green eyes that still didn't have a good comparison, in the dark of a cold October night on a Wyoming ranch porch. Yes, she said. I did. They went inside after a while. The frost settled on the yard and on the pasture and on the aspens and on the new fence along the western boundary of the eastern pasture, covering everything equally, the way the cold does. The new posts and the old ones, the good sections and the weak ones, the ground above the spring box and the ground along the creek, where the water would keep running through winter under the ice. The years that followed were not easy years, because no years in Wyoming territory in the 1880s were easy years. And because the Mercers were not the kind of people who would have recognized an easy year if one had arrived. The winter of 1885 was a hard one, not the worst the territory had seen, but hard enough, with cold that lasted longer than the previous year, and a mid-February ice storm that put a crust on the snow that the cattle broke their legs trying to navigate. Landon lost 3 head that winter. He had gone in with 24 and came through with 21, plus 4 calves, and the calves were all healthy. And when spring came, he did the accounting and found that he was still ahead of where he needed to be, but only just. Vivian kept her own ledger on the eastern pasture operations, had started it in April of the first year without asking, had simply begun recording, and Landon had looked at it one evening and found it more thorough than his own notes, and said nothing except, "You've got the hay costs broken out by month." And she'd said, "Because that's how you see where the waste is," and that was that. The ledger became the ledger. In the spring of 1886, Landon added 12 head to the eastern pasture operation, purchased through a fair deal with a rancher who was downsizing, paid for with the proceeds from the fall market sales of the previous year, no debt, no deferred arrangement. He showed Garrett the purchase papers. Garrett looked at them. He looked at the price Landon had paid, and at the quality of cattle described, and at the terms of the deal. "You negotiated this yourself?" he said. "Vivian looked over my shoulder on the price point," Landon said. "She thought I was going to pay too much." "Were you?" "A little." Garrett handed the papers back. "She has her mother's eye for numbers," he said. He looked at the eastern pasture, which was carrying 36 head now on the upper sections. "You're at the capacity limit for this lease," he said. "Not this year, but next." "I know," Landon said. "There's 80 acres on the south boundary that I've been meaning to fold into the eastern pasture for 10 years, Garrett said. "Bad road access, which is why I haven't worked it, but the grass is good." "I know that parcel," Landon said. "I've looked at it." "I thought you had." Garrett went back toward the barn. "Come find me Thursday, and we'll talk terms." Thursday they talked terms, and the terms were fair, and the 80 acres went into the eastern pasture lease, and by the end of the 1886 season, the Mercer operation had 44 head on 180 acres of good grass with sound infrastructure and 2 years of documented yield history that any assessor in the territory could read and understand. Ellis Calloway came for every fall gather, without fail. He and Landon had established an informal arrangement. Each helped the other during the big seasonal jobs, labor traded for labor, no money changing hands. Ellis had grown his operation to 120 head by the second year, and in the third year he hired his first permanent hand, a young man from Nebraska who reminded Landon in certain ways of Ellis himself, and who Ellis was teaching with the same patience that had been shown to him. and who was learning the way Ellis had learned, by paying attention. Hatch's name came up occasionally in territory news. He had a dispute with a Water Rights Commission in 1886 that he lost after a 6-month legal process. He sold 2 sections of land east of the county seat in 1887 under circumstances that were described as voluntary, and which people who knew him didn't entirely believe were voluntary. He was not gone from the territory and he was not ruined, but the shape of his position had changed. He was no longer the largest operation in the region, no longer the name people thought of first when territory business came up. Whether any of that had to do with Garrett Ashcroft's documented response to his attempted manipulations, Landon couldn't say for certain. What he could say was that Garrett was a man who knew how the territory worked, who had relationships with the county assessor and the territorial recorder and 3 members of the Cattle Association board, and who had spent 30 years building those relationships through straightforward dealing, and who cashed them in rarely and only when something mattered. Whether Hatch's difficulties were the result of Garrett's quiet management of the territory's opinion of him, or whether they were the natural consequence of Hatch's own choices catching up with him over time, was the kind of question that didn't have a clean answer, and probably wasn't meant to. The first child came in 1886, a boy they named after Vivian's mother's maiden name, Thomas, who arrived in April during a week when the eastern pasture calves were also arriving, which meant Landon was covering 3 fronts for 4 days in a row and running on no sleep, and who was, by the 3rd day, the most important of the 3. He was not a peaceful infant. He had opinions from the start and expressed them clearly and loudly, and Vivian managed him with the same direct practicality she managed everything else, and Landon held him in the evenings when the baby had exhausted everyone else and sat with him on the porch in the cool air until he quieted, and looked at him in the particular wondering way of a person encountering something genuinely new, something that has no comparison in prior experience and requires you to build the whole framework from scratch. Garrett came to see the baby on the 2nd day and stood over the cradle for a long time without saying anything. When he finally spoke, he said, "He has his grandmother's mouth." Vivian looked at the baby and then at her father. "You think so?" "I'm certain of it." He straightened. He was 60 years old that year, and the hard winters had put their accounting on him. There was more gray in the iron, and he moved with the deliberateness of a man who has learned to allocate effort carefully. But his eyes were the same, that ice river gray-blue, reading everything as clearly as they ever had. He looked at Landon. "You're managing," he said. "The baby, the cattle, all of it. The one word covered it." "Barely right now," Landon said honestly. "That's managing," Garrett said, and went back to the main house. The second child came in 1888, a girl who they named Margaret without discussion. Vivian had said the name once, quietly, and Landon had said yes, and that was the whole of that conversation. She was a quieter child than Thomas, observant in a way that reminded Landon of her grandfather, watching everything with those eyes that were going to be green like her mother's, and that already seemed to be taking stock of the world in a way that suggested she was unimpressed and would require more data before reaching conclusions. By the autumn of 1889, the Eastern Pasture had become, through 5 years of accumulated decisions, a genuine operation. 60 head on the full 180 acres, a restored line cabin that Landon had rebuilt over 2 winters into something habitable year-round, a hay yield that covered winter needs with surplus to sell, and 2 hired hands who worked the seasonal peaks, and who were learning from Landon the way Landon had learned from years of showing up and paying attention. Constance was still there. She was 18 years old, ancient for a cow, and she didn't do what she'd once done, didn't range and test and watch. She stayed in the lower section now, near the spring box, and the younger cattle gave her a wide berth out of some instinct they didn't understand. And Landon let her be because she'd earned it, and because she was the clearest demonstration he knew of that difficult things, managed with patience over time, become something different than what they were. One evening in October of that year, Garrett came to the eastern pasture fence and stood there while Landon was finishing up the evening check, and Landon came to the fence, and they stood together watching the cattle settle in the last of the light, and Garrett said something he had not said before. "I want to tell you what I was thinking," he said, "when you came to this ranch 5 years ago." Landon waited. "I was thinking," Garrett said, that I had seen 100 men come through this territory with nothing to offer but their willingness to work, and that most of them were honest and decent and capable and would have treated my daughter well. And I had also seen perhaps 3 men in my life who had something else, something I couldn't name then and still struggle to name now, that made them different from capable and decent. Something about the relationship between what they wanted and what they were willing to do, and what they were willing to do when no one was watching. He paused. You rode onto this property with $16 and asked to court my daughter. And when I offered you a test, you didn't ask what you'd get for passing it. You asked when you could start. He looked at Landon. That was when I knew. You couldn't have known then, Landon said. Not fully, but enough to act on. Landon looked at the pasture. The light was going, the cattle shapes dimming. Constance was at the water trough. I wasn't thinking about the test, he said. I was thinking about whether Ellis Calloway's barn was going to hold the winter. I know, Garrett said. That's what I mean. They stood there until the light was fully gone, and the cattle were just sounds in the dark. The particular low sounds of animals settling, breath and movement. The occasional shift and stamp that meant nothing except that they were there and well. Garrett left first, walking back toward the main house with the steady deliberateness of a man who knows his ground so well he doesn't need to see it. Landon stayed a few more minutes. He listened to the cattle. He listened to the frost starting on the grass, the particular creak of it in the quiet. He thought about $16 and a weathered saddle and a 14-year-old boy who had left a hard place in Nebraska and spent 10 years building the capacity to do what needed doing, and who had ridden up a long road one October morning with nothing to offer except what he actually was. He thought about what Garrett had said, about the men who knew what they wanted and knew what they were willing to do. He had never thought of himself in those terms. He had thought in terms of work, and the next thing that needed doing, which perhaps was the same term stated differently. What he knew now, standing at the fence of 180 acres of good Wyoming grassland in the dark, with 60 head settled for the night and the spring box running clean and the fence tight along every boundary, and a woman in the house behind him who had chosen this with her own clear eyes open, and 2 children asleep inside who had the color of her eyes, and the set of her father's jaw, and a grandmother's mouth they'd never seen but were carrying nonetheless. What he knew was this. The territory didn't owe you anything. The land didn't care about your intentions. The cattle didn't notice what you'd sacrificed to keep them fed. The frost came whether or not you'd earned it, and the storms came regardless of how much you deserved fair weather, and the spring arrived on its own schedule without consulting what you'd endured the winter before. None of it responded to who you were. All of it responded to what you did. And what you did, day after day, in the specific places where the work needed doing, without audience and without guarantee, that accumulated into something. Not a fortune, not always. Not a name people recognized in every room, not always. But something real. Something that lasted past the season that produced it. Something that other people could build on, if they chose to. That was the whole of it. That was what he had. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. He went inside. Vivian was at the kitchen table with the ledger, a lamp burning beside her, Thomas asleep in the next room with the particular sudden silence of a child who has spent his energy completely. She looked up when Landon came in, read something in his face, and said, "Your father-in-law talked to you tonight?" "He did. He's been working up to something for a few weeks." She looked at the ledger. "What did he say?" Landon sat down across from her. "He said he knew when you first came to this ranch in October 5 years ago." "He told me something similar," she said. "He said it differently." "What did he tell you?" She closed the ledger. She looked at him with the eyes that still didn't have a good comparison, across a kitchen table in a lamplit room in Wyoming, October 1889, 5 years from $16 and a county social and a fence line on the north slope. "He said," she told him, "that the greatest fortune he ever gave me was not this land or these cattle or this house." Landon waited. "He said it was refusing to let me settle for less than someone who would work beside me instead of in front of me." She held his eyes. And then he went back to his ledger. Landon sat with that for a moment. Outside, the frost was doing what frost does, covering everything equally, the good ground and the difficult ground, the new things and the old ones. Constance was at the water trough. The cattle were settled. The fence was tight. Thomas made a sound in the next room, not waking, just registering existence in the particular noisy way he had, and then went quiet again. "The North Water Line," Landon said. "I looked at it this morning," Vivian said. "It's fine." "You checked it already." "I checked it Tuesday," she said. "And again this morning." She opened the ledger again. "I know how you think." He looked at her for a moment. She was already back in the numbers, her finger moving down the column, her mind on the accounting. He picked up the lamp and went to check on Thomas. Some things you don't say. Some things are already said. In the work and the ledger and the 20 minutes at a county social and the 11 letters and the fence line in the April morning and all the days after, accumulated and real and not going anywhere. He looked at his son's face in the lamplight. Thomas slept the way he did everything. Completely, with total commitment, as if sleeping were the most important project he'd undertaken and he wasn't going to do it halfway. He had his grandmother's mouth. He had his mother's eyes, which would go green as spring grass when they settled into their real color. He had his father's hands, already small versions. The same proportions, the same width across the palm. What he didn't have yet was a clue what any of it was for, or what the territory would require of him, or what kind of work would need doing in whatever years came to him. He'd find out. They all found out, in the specific places and specific seasons where the finding happened. Landon set the lamp on the table by the door and went back to the kitchen, and the frost kept settling outside, and the cattle were where they needed to be, and Vivian turned a page in the ledger, and the lamp burned steady in the October dark.